So good morning, everyone, and welcome to day number 2 of the JAR conference. Now you're wondering, why am I always smiling? Why do I use my hands so expressively today? Well, if I had to summarize yesterday's papers, then I think my summary would be the following. First, smile as much as you can so that people perceive you as more attractive. Second, use your hands expressively because this predicts future success. Third one, don't forget to turn off your phone because someone might catch up your pings and then afterwards track you and use for their research. And number 4, well, hopefully over the course of your presentation, your option value of the job market prospects doesn't change unexpectedly so that you can further your career. Now, today we're going to hear about transparency in the cryptocurrency market, as well as the applications of machine learning. But before we go there, I would rather use the next 5 minutes to briefly remind you of 2 current calls for papers that the Journal of Accounting Research has currently outstanding. Now, the first one is with regard to a registered report conference. As some of you might remember, we had the first registered report conference a few years back, and we are now doing a second one, but this time we change it up a little bit. Remember the first one there, the conference was at the very end when the authors presented the results of their registered reports. Now this year we moved the conference earlier on so that the authors will be able to present their first stage proposals to the conference audience, and there will get some feedback on those proposals that afterwards they can incorporate in the proposals and refine them before resubmit them again. Now, if this is something of interest to you, then go check out our website, but you have to hurry up because the deadline for submission will be August 4th and the conference will be held in October. Now, the second conference or the second call for papers is with regard to next year's JAR conference, which hopefully will be in person in Chicago. Now, the topic of the conference is, as always, current topics in accounting, but this time or for next year, we are particularly interested in papers that deal with any aspect of ESG, CSR, or sustainability reporting. So if you work on projects, let's say, that look at the real effects of ESG reporting or at the capital market effects of new mandates that have been introduced over the world, or you're looking into issues of materiality with regard to ESG reporting, which is crucial in that area, or any other aspects, then that would be a conference of interest, or should be a conference of interest to you. So please check out our website again, where you will find additional information on the call for research. I will post the link in the chat to anyone so that you can find the information there. All right. Now we're still a little bit ahead of time, but I would think that we have a critical mass so that we can start with our first presentation of the day. Now, the first paper deals with transparency in the crypto market, and the presenter will be Daniel Rabetti, and managing the blogs will be Dan Amiran and Bjorn Jorgensen. Daniel, are you here? Daniel, are you here? I can see your slides, but I can't see your face yet.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now that's working.
Yes, I'm here. Can you see me too?
Yes, I can see you too.
All right, well, let's start.
All right, so same rules as yesterday, 5 minutes uninterrupted, and then afterwards I will manage the questions.
All right, so thank you very much, Lucy, for introducing us. First, I would like to thank JAR editors for having our paper in the conference, and Lucy Hale, our editor, and anonymous reviewer that provided feedback that substantially improved our paper. So in this paper, we're looking to whether it's possible to exploit blockchain transparency and make economics inference from blockchain data. We use terrorist financing as a laboratory. So the motivation with this paper stems from the last year evolution of blockchain analytics. There's a seminal work by Foley et al. 2019 that shows that more than 1/4 of Bitcoin users and half of the Bitcoin transactions are linked to illicit activities. And there has been a lot of work showing other dark aspects of Bitcoin usage in money laundering, inflating volumes, and manipulating cryptocurrency prices. What interests us is whether Bitcoin is used to finance terrorist activities. So there's some evidence out there on donation campaigns. You can see here this illustration. This is a donation campaign by Al-Qassam Brigades. They put in their main website calling for donations and a Bitcoin address. Now, this is not a smart way of doing so because everybody knows this particular address belongs to a terrorist organization. And so the DOJ last year seized Al-Qassam wallets and other wallets that belong to other donation campaigns. So what we think is we do something different in this paper. And what we think is that these terrorist organizations, they may have other wallets that have not been tracked by agencies and that they can use that to finance large-scale terrorist attacks. So the goal of this paper is whether it's possible to find that evidence of transfers between terrorist organizations and terrorists on the ground. Now, there's an increasing relevance of blockchain on accounting research, and that starts with Institute of Chartered Accountants in 2018 piece, where they describe blockchain as an accounting technology that's concerned with the transfer of ownership of assets and maintaining a ledger of accurate financial information. Now, if this is what practitioners have been doing the last 3 years, we as accounting researchers have to expand our knowledge into this field. Also, we can no longer ignore Bitcoin. Bitcoin has recently surpassed $1 trillion in market capitalization. This morning it was trading nearly $60,000 and has been recently commended by the Louisiana House of Representatives. And what's interesting about this commendation and that's encouraged local governments. Hello? Local governments to benefit from this technology. So let's narrow down a bit and show what's the problem and how transparency helps us to approach a solution. Here are the terrorist organizations and they run Bitcoin donation campaigns. Now they have to reveal their addresses so that they can get Bitcoins from donors. Because they are revealing that public information, agencies can seize those wallets and that's what happened. However, it's plausible to assume that they have other wallets that have not been yet seized and tracked. And so in possession of those Bitcoins, they can finance large-scale terrorist attacks. However, they are not sending Bitcoins directly to operatives on the ground because they know this information is immutably stored on the blockchain and can be accessed by the public. So they will send that to a mixer. A mixer is a money laundering scheme, very popular service in the Bitcoin ecosystem that gets an input reshuffling across several addresses before sending it to the final destination. So it makes harder to track those transfers and the public ledger. Now, once those operatives have those Bitcoins, they have to finance local operations. So they have to convert these Bitcoins to cash. Now, the problem is we don't know those operatives' wallet addresses. However, we do know the addresses for mixers and crypto exchanges, as these are large public services in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So our solution is to track the launderers. And you find the evidence using event study anomalous transfers in the vicinity of large-scale terrorist attacks. Now, let me just give you the main takeaways of the paper before getting questions. These results suggest that at least on the short term, transparency alone is not enough to mitigate or to curb terrorist activities. So there's some policy considerations on what to regulate and how to regulate. However, on the long term, the increasing scrutiny by the public with academic research such as ours, Foley et al., for instance, that potentially dissuades those illicit users off the Bitcoin ecosystem. So in the long term, the demand for regulation is an open question. Therefore, financing terrorist activities with blockchain-based currencies is essentially a disclosure choice, where the terror financier has to either go to a more common venue, say a bank, and disclose a lot of information privately. However, the transfers information are not available for the outsiders. Only the bank, in some instances, the regulator will have access to that information. Or she can go to a blockchain-based cryptocurrency, and nobody will know who is the owner of those assets, but the information of the transfers will be available on the blockchain. So I think if there are questions, now is a good moment.
Okay, Daniele, you go first. Huh?
Hi, Daniel. Can you hear me?
Hey. Hi, Daniel. Yes.
Very interesting paper. I really like it. I have two points. One is more related to this slide, so I think it's more related to the motivation and contribution of the paper. And the other one I think is more conceptual, and so it's more a curiosity rather than a question. So related to the motivation of the paper, you guys are pushing a lot this transparency angle, but if we go back to the disclosure literature, firms usually trade off benefits and costs of transparency when they make their decision. Here in this setting, to me, sounds, I mean, it reads a little bit more as a stretch, because these, criminal organizations, they don't really have any benefits from transparency, but they just have a cost of being more or less transparent, according to your arguments. So I was wondering if you can elaborate on that point a little more. And the other one is quick and is more like conceptual. Like you guys refer a lot to Bitcoin, but I'm trying to understand if you use Bitcoin to really refer to Bitcoin or just in general to cryptocurrencies, because the articles that you are, the newspaper and the media article that you're referring to usually refer to Bitcoins in a very general way. And they don't really mean Bitcoin, but they mean a lot of currencies. And we know that these criminal organizations usually use other currencies that are faster, cheaper, and less tractable. For instance, they use Monero, which is very opaque. They use Dash. They use other currencies rather than Bitcoin, especially now that the market is booming. It's going to be very difficult to understand what is driving, what of that market is driven by organizations like this and what is just driven by hype and euphoria. So that was more my clarification point.
Sure. So Daniel, thank you very much for your questions. Very interesting. I'll start with the second one. We use Bitcoin as this is the most popular implementation of a blockchain system. Okay, so that's our main focus, but we also analyze Ripple. You're gonna see one of our complementary analysis. In the period of time that we do this analysis is from 2015 to 2019. So it's true that there are other cryptocurrencies, but we assume and we have evidence that those were not that used for illicit activities, as they were not as popular as Bitcoin. So it's right that with the rise of more opaque cryptocurrencies that have better privacy methods for their use, such as Monero, Zcash, and so on, the idea is that those cryptocurrencies will accommodate the demand for illicit activities, including terrorist activities. So that's one. Now, related to your first point, I think that you mentioned what's the analogy for disclosure choice here, if I understood correctly. If this is what you mentioned, then for us, the system is transparent, and it's not clear whether terrorist financier will choose blockchain-based cryptocurrency to finance their activities. They may have other options. However, if she goes to this system, then there is a disclosed related cost, which is the information will be publicly available and may be accessed by agencies, for instance, that can lead to actually foiling that operations or the secrecy of that operations. That is the disclosure related cost. I think what's analogous for us in the accounting literature are, for instance, disclosure papers that look into the firm's decision about going to a private borrowing or going to a public debt market. And for instance, I think Delaware 2011, if it's the proper year, shows that going to a public debt, it discloses information also to competitors. So there's also disclosure related costs there. So I think that's the analogy with your first question.
And the point,
Okay.
the cost part is clear to me. Is the benefit part that was a little bit less clear. Like there are always.
Oh, okay. So the benefit, why they would go for Bitcoin? First, because Bitcoin is the most popular cryptocurrency. It is used worldwide. And there was a time, at least in the beginning, let's say until mid 2017 or 2018, that the system was still perceived as anonymous. So nobody knew that the identity could be revealed until the rise of blockchain analytics in the last 3 years. So in the period of time.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I meant the benefits of disclosure. I mean, most of the time, benefits and cost of disclosure. In this case, I see only cost, but that's fine. I mean, your explanation on the cost is clear. The part on the benefits of disclosure was a little bit less clear to me. Sorry if I interrupted you.
Okay, then let's go to Eva.
Hi, Daniel. Very fascinating empirical work and clearly of ginormous potential practical relevance, I would say, too. My main issue relates actually to something Daniele said. I'm going to try and phrase it a little bit differently. So it's also related to the theoretical motivation that you push in the paper quite repeatedly, that the study is motivated by an interest in the causes and consequences of the terror financier's choice, right? Either you obtain financing by disclosing the detailed information privately to the bank, or you get less detailed information, but you disclose it publicly. I also felt this was contrived, maybe for a slightly different reason than Daniele, because I don't think you actually study this trade-off, right? You only observe the crypto channel here. And sort of in terms of the causes or the determinants, you can't really speak to whether this source of financing is used as a complement or a substitute for what they might have done previously in the traditional bank financing. And also in terms of outcomes, you cannot really compare the likelihood of discovering a terror attack is about to take place under the bank financing system, because you can't observe the attacks financed with bank financing that might have been prevented, because the banks have to flag suspect transactions under to intelligence services under their AML and terror financing responsibilities. So again, sort of another reason why I felt that, on top of what Daniela was saying, that this is a little bit contrived. But don't get me wrong, I really love the empirical work you're doing in the paper. It's just the theoretical motivation that was a little contrived to me.
Okay, Eva, thank you for your comments, and I appreciate that you like the paper. I think the disclosure choice is just one aspect of our contribution. The next slide is about the contribution. So perhaps once we hit them, it will be more clear. But on what you said, at least for us, it's the first time that, indeed you're right, we cannot observe those activities at the bank level, right? So for us, it's an opportunity to exploit the opportunity that we can actually observe these activities on the blockchain-based system. This is where the feature of transparency comes to play. And I think that the main contribution of the paper does not relate to the disclosure choice. That is one contribution, but it's not the main contribution. I believe that the main contribution of the paper is related to the interplay of transparency and regulation. In a sense that, as I said before, in the short term, that transparency seems not to be enough to curb illegal activities. However, so you should think about what to regulate and how to regulate. But in the long term, with more scrutiny of the public and more analysis, the same transparency has the potential to scare those illicit users off of the system. So we think that this is the central contribution of the paper. However, it's interesting today to discuss the disclosure choice, as we can also aggregate and accommodate this input in revising the paper. So thank you.
All right, then why don't you go ahead with the paper a little bit before we take more questions?
Oh, yes, great. So I'll go to the literature because I see most of the questions are falling in this field. So as I said, I will not repeat the disclosure choice, and I also we find an analogous to affirm the decision to the private to public debt. Now, another aspect of the accounting literature that we believe, and this is central for our paper, as I was just saying, commenting to Eva comments, is that we provide the Deloitte's and Wysock 2016 has calls for more papers on the interplay of transparency and regulation, and possibly in other settings. This is what we are doing here. And as I said, again, there is this trade-off on the short term, the transparency impacts on the regulation in the long term. And more importantly, there is a debate, and this is an important debate in the last years surrounding cryptocurrency regulation. And our analysis shows that the problematic node is in the ecosystem, is the crypto exchange, and the way to regulate or to curb illicit activities and terrorist activities is by approximating anti-money laundering measures and other compliance measures such as KYC measures to international banking standards. So on that tone, we joined this debate with this increasing number of papers in the crypto space showing different angles that crypto exchanges are a problematic node. Now, a third aspect of the accounting literature that we joined is this increasing accounting research literature that examines the transparency on alternative finance platforms. So you see here papers on peer-to-peer lending markets, initial coin offering markets. I see Daniel already asked a question, and also in the real-world crowdfunding markets. Now, if you zoom out a bit, our paper provides an empirical novel contribution to terrorist financing, which is a literature that is mostly driven by qualitative research. And the reason is tracking funds associated with terrorist finance is hard because these terrorist organizations, they are specialized into camouflaging those transfers. So the strategy of the paper is that we focus on the short term or the transfers between terrorist organizations and terrorists on the ground, as opposed to the evidence or donation campaigns, which is a more long-term characteristics. The advantage is that we don't need to know the wallets, the terrorist wallets in advance. However, we had to invest time on mapping or revealing identities for larger businesses in the Bitcoin ecosystem, exchanges, dark markets, mixers, and so on. The way we reveal their identities, we use the assistance of wallet explorers, social media, and dark web user lists. And once you know that an address belongs to a particular user, you can check, and this is the feature of blockchain transparency, the activity of that address. If that address corresponds with other addresses in the same transaction, we can build a large data set. So let's just give you this example, and then I can get questions. So here's how it works. Let's say, and this is the transparency angle. Anne, Bob, and Carl are addresses on the blockchain system. Now I know that Anne belongs to an online shop because I either transacted with that online shop in the past or that information is publicly available somewhere else. Now I don't know Bob and Carl, who are the owners of these addresses. But what the blockchain transparency permits is that I can get an address and check the transactions and the balance and how much Bitcoins received and sent. And more than that, I can check all the interactions of that address with other addresses in the blockchain system. So for instance, if I take N, which is an address that I know, and check the past history of transactions, in a particular transaction, N and Bob co-spend, meaning they are part of the same input, it must be that Bob also belongs to the same online shop. I repeated this exercise with Bob and I find that Carl also corresponding in another transaction. That means that they also belongs to the same online shop. And by doing so several times, I can create a data set at the user level with mapped and known addresses. So should I continue with the data?
We have a question by Christian.
Okay.
Just a quick one, and maybe it's a stupid question, but you sort of condition things on the vicinity of terrorist attacks, right? But how important is it to be close in terms of like the delivery of the money? I mean, I understand that, you know, like weapons and, you know, other things need to obviously be delivered and need to be close, but the payments for those could be anywhere. And in fact, it might even be better to be further away in terms of, you know, avoiding that kind of detection that you're doing.
Right. That's an excellent question, Christian. Thank you very much. So there's two things here. One is the planning and the other is executing. So indeed, planning, we don't know how long it takes. Could it be 1 year? Okay. But executing, which is actually, you know, having an operative in foreign territory, for instance, the Sri Lankan Easter bombing, right? The Islamic State sent operatives to that country to execute the operations. Now, the transfer has to occur in some time that's not too long, because the longer it takes, the more the operation secrecy is exposed. And we discussed with several experts. Believe here in Israel, there's a lot of experts on terrorism financing, and that's the anecdote that we have. Now, another anecdote that we have, for instance, and I will show in a couple of slides ahead, is that a Paris attack that was a very deadly attack. There was evidence that the machine gun was bought a week before the event took place for $10,000 in the black market. So there's some evidence of the short term. But you're right. It could be that maybe the
Daniel, Daniel, let me just interrupt you for 1 second here. Maybe
yes.
There's just a semantic issue then. So when you say vicinity, you mean close in time, not necessarily close in location or something like that, right?
Close
so
in time.
you're not doing anything with geography, right? But to me,
no.
Okay.
Correct. 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after the event takes place. That's
so the idea is that there's anecdotal evidence that much of this starts just shortly before, but in terms of where this happens, it doesn't matter at all for you.
Exactly.
Okay.
Correct. Do you have more questions, or should I continue?
Now, Daniel, maybe one question on my own along the same lines.
Sure.
Why would the terrorists use a fairly sophisticated system like Bitcoins and not something, I don't know, which is cell phone based like Venmo or similar, or are these Islamic based financing systems? Why would they go for something that requires resources, sophistication, and takes time sometimes to be executed? So
that's a great question, Lutzi. Thank you. There are two reasons. One is that you're right; they could go to other methods, as you say. There's a system called Hawala that could be used. However, since the 9/11, there has been a lot of pressure on those systems. They have been, the agencies have been tracking those systems, stopping their activities, and so on. So it's been hard for those terrorist organizations to keep financing those systems. And cryptocurrencies, the rise of cryptocurrencies, was an opportunity for these terrorist organizations to find a way of financing those activities. Now, it's not immediately clear that that happens, because there's no evidence that terrorist organizations are using Binance to finance terrorist attacks. And here's where we believe that our paper can also show some contribution. If we are able to pick some of those economic channels, we can claim that we have some evidence that this is what actually happened during this period of time, at least for large-scale terrorist attacks. Does it answer your question? Okay,
yeah. Then we have another question by John, and then afterwards you can continue.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I had the similar notion as Lutzi of like, I'm assuming before they were using like Western Union to do money transfers between countries, or PayPal. Right. Like, is there any difference in kind of what these companies like Western Union, which is kind of like a closed ecosystem, are they doing similar tracking like you guys are doing with the Bitcoin? Like, so I'm assuming there must be like a literature from that angle, right? In terms of what people have done with Western Union and PayPal for tracking for money laundering. And so yes. Like, is there any way that you could exploit that as well during the sample period? Like, I know in one case, like Western Union was stopping transfers by Muslims because if the account had the name, I don't know, Mohammed, and they got in the news for that. Can you exploit that as like a shifter where can push people to kind of move to a different system or something like that?
Sure. Thank you, John, for your suggestion. That's great. Maybe we can add that discussion to the paper. There's work on that already. But again, I think the question is why they would go for a cryptocurrency, right? And that's potentially an alternative method. And one of there's some aspects of the Bitcoin, for instance, that's attractive for the terrorist financier, right? So it's anonymous. It can be used. It's easier to. You don't need to disclose information privately, as opposed to, I believe, other systems. But the problem is that information is stored on the blockchain. But that problem starts peaking on the later moment, which I expect to clarify with the.
I just want to clarify, like at the end, like when you bought the gun, for example, in your example, you still need to translate that into cash somewhere.
Exactly, in the crypto exchange. Exactly.
So there still has to be like that. You still need to get back to cash. Right?
Oh yeah, either to cash or to other cryptocurrency. But you're right. The operative has to use a crypto exchange for that service. You're totally right. And this is where we are focusing our analysis in that crypto exchange in the vicinity of large-scale respect to see if there's some abnormality. That's the idea. Okay. Ex ante, we don't know what you're gonna find because there's no evidence out there. So we managed to. Yes.
Regina directly related, or can you wait for us a few minutes? Can wait. Okay, so then why don't you go on for a bit and then we go back.
Okay, so we succeeded mapping 339 large businesses in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So for instance, Binance is one user in our data set, and Binance is the largest crypto exchange with over 200,000 addresses and about 1 million transactions. We do some cleaning on the data. For instance, we eliminate wallets or users that don't have interactions with other users. We cannot make economic inferences from it. For instance, cold storages has about 134,000 wallets that we exclude. This is about 0.05% of the data doesn't alter our results. So we have in the final sample using in this paper of 338 users. So we allocate the services into portfolios. So a crypto exchange will go to exchange. So we have 97 crypto exchanges. We have dark markets, gambling, mixed learning services. We have no discretion on this allocation. We follow practitioners. There are, for instance, wallet explorers that provide this kind of classification, with exception to dark markets that we follow fully out 2019 and separated from services. So we succeeded mapping about 136 million transactions that happened between 2014 and 2019. Now, to give a context to this number, since inception, 2009 to this year, there's about 500,000 transactions. This is more than 1/4 for a smaller period of time. And this is for a known universe of mapped users. An average transfer is a little bit more than 10 Bitcoins, which shows that those are larger businesses. So sometimes we have an extremely large transfer. However, most of the transfer are below 1 Bitcoin, which shows that there's a skew to the right distribution. An exchange has, on average, the largest balance, which is consistent with the business model that they need in liquidity. And dark markets are one of the first type of business to accept payments. So they're the oldest on average. For instance, Silk Road, which is a famous dark market that was seized 2 years ago by the FBI, they used to sell drugs for Bitcoins. So this is the summary of our analysis. The main analysis is an event study, and we look into cumulative abnormal volume responses in the vicinity of large-scale terrorist attacks. We have some predictions that we provide empirical support to. We have a complementary analysis that we do a forensic piece where we look into a large-scale terrorist attack and try to pinpoint transfers and track it on the blockchain system. And you have an additional analysis where we want to use these insights from the previous analysis and building a machine learning algorithms to predict terrorist attacks. So here's an example that I told you.
Maybe then we go to Regina for her question before you start with your first analysis.
Okay.
So fascinating paper, I have to say, as everybody else mentioned. My question was more general. You mentioned that one of your important contribution is this interplay between regulation and transparency. And you refer, for example, to some of the Christians' works in regulation. So when I was reading the paper, what I thought mainly the difference between regular setting, when we talk about transparency and regulation, we talk about companies, right? So you impose regulation, and companies stay, they cannot disappear. So what happens in your setting, the moment the regulation comes in or the moment the transparency becomes bigger, like greater, this terrorists, they will just disappear, right? They will find another way to go or another venue. So what are we going exactly to achieve or by regulation and transparency? And especially you mentioned you already talked to some intelligence officers, and why wouldn't they try to track it, right? So the moment somebody tracks it and knows that increase in volume drives, it can predict at least a day before. Day before is a big deal, right? During the day, you can probably target all your suspicious players in a local market. So I wasn't sure what we would achieve, unfortunately, by transparency in the setting, because you will just drive these terrorist players to go to some other venue.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Regina. That's an excellent point. The answer is not it's not so clear because there's a trade-off, right? On the short term, we could, regulation could make the crypto exchanges approximate bank standards on anti-money laundering and KYC measures. Last week, that's what happened in Turkey, and they did that for the local crypto exchanges. And the idea is to prevent illicit activities happening in the ecosystem. So that will help. However, I think what's fascinating about the blockchain system is that transparency has the potential to be a substitute for regulation in the long term. And this is something that we don't see on the accounting settings, for instance, right? Unless we go, I know 100 and 150 years back to mid-19th century in Scotland, where investors would go to firms and knock their offices and look into the books to see the accounting information there, right? And that may be a potential of blockchain in the future. If a blockchain in the future is used for firms to provide real-time information, that is the same as opening the books for an investor. So there is a lot of that can be discussed with this exercise of looking to the transparency of blockchain, how powerful that is, and how the information is transmitted and it can be analyzed. And we are looking here for the most, or for the hardest type of activity, which is terrorist financing. They're specialized into camouflaging transfers. If even that is possible to surface in a blockchain system, it means that transparency is indeed something about this technology. So we see that, for instance, auditors have been investing a lot in the last years on private blockchain systems to improve communications with firms and get a better or more accurate and rapidly information. So we think that we can also promote some future debate on the implementation of a blockchain into more accounting related settings.
Thank you.
Does it answer your question?
A little bit. I'll keep listening.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
sure.
Maybe Shugada add your question as well.
Thank you, Lutzi. Yeah, this is actually related to what Regina asked, particularly because if you extend your analysis to looking at predicting terrorist attacks. Something that immediately sort of struck me was, what else are these transactions linked to, right? So for example, there is the obvious issue of type 1 error. If you start seeing spikes in Bitcoin activity and then start using it to predict terrorist attacks, the FBI cannot really devote resources to tracking all of these down. So have you thought about how these may be linked to other aspects of terrorist activity, like a key person in a network goes into hiding or something like that? I mean, because you have the attacks, you can actually trace back as to what else happens along with a spike in volume around the attacks. And that can in turn help build a better prediction model, it seems like.
Okay, so that's a good question. Now, if you look into what happens to returns predictability with more research, it's the same. We lose its strength in the long term because a lot of research shows what motivates trading around some, let's say, information that has been disclosed. It's the same with the blockchain system. We are now surfacing these episodes that dissuades illicit users. In the long term, we expect that we won't see a Bitcoin usage for terrorist financing. The same would happen if we did not disclose it. However, the FBI information on seizing donation campaigns goes out to the public. Now, what happens before an event takes place? It's very unlikely that the results we find, even with the event study, in a such short window, to be driven by alternative channels. After the event takes place, well, that's, there's a negative market reactions, maybe illicit other activities or illicit activities that are unrelated to the terrorist event also want to keep themselves under the radar, so suppress Bitcoin volume. So after the event takes place, something else. But before, we find it hard that there is something else driving our results here.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.
All right, then go ahead with presenting results for the event study.
Okay, so I'll skip some slides. I think, no, you are still good. So this is just an example of the, an anecdote that a machine gun was bought for $10,000 a week before the Paris attack. If that was financed with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is going through these money laundering schemes and potentially generating large abnormal volumes, we would be able to pick with an event study. Here's an example, and this is actual example. That's for Alcasan donation campaigns. The red dots is the Alcasan final wallet that receives 51 transfers at $4,200. All the blue dots near the center of the gravity are the final transfers, and all the dots further from the center of the gravity, they are reshuffling or this mixing activities to make tracking those transfers in the blockchain hard. So there's a reshuffling factor here of 38 reshuffling transactions for each final transaction. And this is a donation campaign, which is less timely and less risky than financing large-scale terrorist attacks. So expect 2 times or 3 times more money laundering activities. Now, we use for the event study, we use a parsimonious method. For the Bitcoin volume, we use the total sum of inbound and outbound transfers at the user level. We mean adjust it by the period of time of 20 days before the first day in the event window, and we average it at the user portfolio. The sum of those averages is the cumulative abnormal volume measure in the event window. Now there's an important choice here, and I think that some question came before about the vicinity. We are using 2 weeks before the event takes place and 2 weeks after. There are 2 important things here. First, it's a short term. We expect that the financing of large-scale terrorist attacks or the transfer between a terrorist organization and terrorists on the ground happens in the 2 weeks. And the second is that if we expand this event window, we are likely to include, first, unrelated events or other similar large-scale terrorist attacks, which that would contaminate our coefficients in this volatility. So by design, we are keeping this window short. I will show later the coefficients and what happens when we expand the window. Now, for the vector of terrorist attacks, we rely on the Global Terrorist Database. It's used for several academic papers. And there's too many events, so we filter for larger scale terrorist attacks, and scaling is a proxy based on the total number of injured and dead, with some level of logistic. So there has to be multiple bombing or mass shooting, something that needs financing. And that happens overseas. Overseas means outside the main terrorist organization's territory. So I already said what to expect for the cumulative abnormal responses direction. So let's go to the first table results.
Daniel, Sanjay has a question before you.
Okay, sure.
Hi, Daniel. I really liked your paper. It's a very interesting paper. I have one clarification. Could you go back to a couple of slides? One more, please. One more. Yeah. So no, just next to that, where you're showing those the amount and the number of people killed.
Oh,
yes.
Here.
So yeah. So I see this estimated cost to be, let's say the Paris is $10,000. Now, I was just checking. So 1 Bitcoin is right now around $55,000. Is there an echo or something? Sorry.
Sanjay, just mute yourself for a second. You seem to have.
Okay.
Now try again.
Hi, is it okay?
Yes.
I think it's okay now. So then we are talking about, as I was saying, this $10,000 and 1 Bitcoin is around, let's say, 55,000 USD. So we're talking about a fraction of a Bitcoin, right? So how does this translate? I'm ignorant about it. Like, how does this? You have it costs one. Like what, 10,000 and let's say 60,000. So 1/6 of a Bitcoin we are talking about. And is that a major volume, you'll say, or am I missing something?
We just unmute because I was muted. Thank you for your question. This is in 2015. So that was less than $1,000 Bitcoin unit. And so which is about 10 Bitcoin as a financing for this particular event. But I see your point. Most of so our data coverage is until 2018. There's a period of time, and in the turn of the year 2017, that Bitcoin reached above $10,000, but never been more than that across after that period of time. And we also have robustness stats when excluding periods of time where Bitcoin has reached more than $10,000. So it's not $10,000 in Bitcoins that we are capturing in our event study. However, the mixing activity of this $10,000, in which it consists of reshuffling this transfer 100 times on the blockchain system before sending it to operatives in the ground. So this reshuffling generates a lot of volume because it has to transfer across several addresses in a very short span of time. So that's what we pick. Well, we believe we pick, or the rationale for the event study for the pick data abnormality. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So I think I was here, and here's the first results for our prediction is that we would observe a large cumulative abnormal volume in the weeks before the large-scale terrorist attacks takes place. And here I'm using 44 large-scale terrorist attacks. Here's the average cumulative abnormal volume of 36.56%, consistent with our prediction and patterns from terrorist financing. Now, for the weeks after, we'd expect that all these money laundering schemes, they stop the activities, so we would see a normalization of the abnormal volume measures. However, since this is also in the post-event window, and those are large-scale terrorist attacks that surpasses Bitcoin volume, we see a negative coefficient. So this window is contaminated with negative market reaction. On average, this is on the vicinity of the large-scale terrorist attacks, 22.42% cumulative abnormal volume. Now, the referee asked us to provide some estimate for the costs of financing a large-scale terrorist attacks. So we use our measure of abnormality, the nominal volume of Bitcoins, and the expected reshuffling factor. Also, the price of Bitcoin in the vicinity of those large 44 terrorist attacks. And that's an estimated upper bound of $105,000. Now that's an upper bound cost because it's assuming that all the abnormality translates to terrorist financing, which is likely overshooting. So here's how this cumulative abnormal volume looks, or the evolution centered at, around the event date. You can see that there's a spike on the volume a week before the event takes place, and then a normalization of the volume levels in negative cumulative abnormal volume that's probably driven by negative market reactions. Now, we have robustness tests for the event window. As I said, if you expand the event window, we likely induce volatility by having similar size terrorist attacks. The first column is the R specification, and here is for the event window. When you go to 30 days, there's not too much change on the coefficients, but when you go to 45 days, that goes to extremely large, which likely is a result of that induced volatility. The same happens when we expand the estimated window, not much to 90 days, but to 180 days, there still persists some effects. In that, we conclude two things. First, that we have robustness for our main specification. And for the shorter windows, the coefficient seems unaltered. But as we increase the event window, induces volatility. So empirically, the choice for a short event window seems adequate. Now, the second prediction, and this is following a suggestion by the referee, is that large-scale terrorist attack are expected to have more financing than mid-scale terrorist attack, and low-scale terrorist attack may have no finance at all. So what we do the deciles by destruction, and you take the 5 first deciles, or attacks that have less than total sum of injured and dead equal 3, and we calculate the coefficients in the similar form. We do the same for mid-scale terrorist attacks, and the last decile, or the largest decile, is the one that we used in the previous analysis. Since there are too many events on these deciles, we have to bootstrap it and run 50 runs. And here we are reporting the average coefficients. So for the mid-scale events, there's still some positive effects. It's small, but it's statistically significant. And the patterns are consistent with terrorist finance for some of those events. Now for low scale or small scale terrorist attacks, those results are not economically significant. The difference between mid and small is still positive, which shows that some scaling effect. But indeed, when you take large scale or the largest decile against mid scale terrorist attacks, that's where the responses are. Bitcoin is likely financing those large scale events.
All right, let's take a few more questions. Christian,
Okay.
you're first. Huh?
Your last test, I think, helps probably, or helps with the comment I was going to make. But since we don't have a good sense, like for stock returns, we have a reasonable sense for like what is a big event return or what is big abnormal volume on a given day, because we've studied this around a number of other events. But I wonder whether you should, and I don't know whether that's too much of a fishing expedition in Bitcoin, but if there's sort of ways to say, here's some other big information events in the, that might be relevant to the Bitcoin market, and or you pick sort of randomly, because I don't have a good sense for how easy or difficult it would be for you to find sort of these kind of events like the ones you showed us in the event study. Now, again, I think the mid, low, and high kind of shows that, well, if you condition on low, you don't get anything that looks like the high. So that is helpful and in the same direction. But I still think, given that we have so little knowledge about this market, or at least it would be useful to have sort of some benchmarking of sort.
Yeah, that's great, Christian. We'll definitely add that. We have some robustness tests with holiday events and some other type of events, but it's hard to know which kind of event would actually cause a similar effect. But we do have those, and we thought to include that in appendix. But perhaps we should include that in the paper, just as an illustration as you suggested. So thank you very much for your comment.
Hans was there too, but now he's gone.
One hand is gone.
Okay. No, okay. Well, basically, I think you need to do much more, I think, on when are these attacks happening, right? I mean, because this is not random, right? It's clearly around holidays. It's when people travel a lot, right? So I would try. It's very hard from the paper to understand what is determining the timing of the terror attacks. And it's very, very likely that that's correlated with things that are also correlated with the volume of Bitcoin transactions.
That's a great comment, Hans. Thank you very much. Indeed, 17% of the events happens on holidays. And it's okay. We can provide that information for more clarity in the paper. But what we do, we exclude those holidays episodes, and the results still remain. But we definitely can put that to robustness table on the paper, so it could clarify better. Okay, does it address your comment?
I mean, I mean, it's not just holidays, right? It's like anytime somebody travels, holidays is an extreme event, right? So you're just taking out the extreme ones, but terrorists are not just attacking randomly, right? They do it at a certain period in time when they think they'll get more attention or something like that, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
Which is usually holidays. For instance,
yeah, or something. Yeah.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying that the holidays is usually the period of time that the terrorists will decide to execute an attack, and that goes with your intuition, which is correct. That is, people will be crowded. There will be more people, so terrorists can actually exponentially increase their damage, right? So our largest terrorist attacks is the Sri Lankan Easter bombing that happened in Eastern. So this is just an example. But yeah, we could think about whether there's other patterns for other dates, but the one that immediately pops out is holidays. If I don't have more questions, then I think I'll just continue.
Daniela, quick question.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Daniel, my question, maybe it's a suggestion sort of related to the Christian point before. And maybe you do it in the paper and I miss it, but one thing that you can do, the Bitcoin have had some periods of extreme high volatility and extreme high returns, and
right.
Also, and I believe also abnormal volume. So maybe one thing that you can do is to see how many instances of abnormal return or abnormal volumes, do not lead to a terrorist attack, or abnormal volumes in the range of those that you identify as those prior to a terrorist attack. That will give you a sense. If you find that there are very few instances, that I think it's another evidence that you're capturing the right thing.
That's a great suggestion, Danielle. We'll definitely do that. Thank you a lot. That's great. We'll definitely do that.
So Daniel, you have roughly 10 minutes, so you should probably dedicate half each to the two remaining tests.
Okay, so let me conclude the event study. We do this cross-sectional results, and that, as expected and explained earlier, we find evidence on exchange and mixers. However, since mixers are at the daily basis providing reshuffling services to other market participants, such as dark markets, with the unexpected demand for tourist financiers, there's a crowd out effect, which is preceded by the negative cumulative abnormal volume in the vicinity of the exact same attacks. I will move just to the other pieces of analysis so that you can also get some comments on. Okay, and here is some conclusions, which I will wrap up in the end of the paper. So we do some complementary analysis, and now we're moving from the user level data to the transfer level data. And our idea is, let's pick the largest event, which actually happened in the holiday. The Sri Lankan Easter bombing happened in the Easter, and see whether we are able to flag some anomalous transfers in the vicinity of that event. And we use rolling 3 sigma rule, which is basically at the user level. Let's see whether a transfer falls off 3 standard deviations from the mean at that exactly close vicinity. So this is what happens for the 2 weeks before the Sri Lankan Easter bombing. 48 users of our data set presented some of the transfers that fall off that vicinity, that 3 standard deviations. That's about 2.8 or 3 transfers per user with this technique. Now, what do we do? 48 users, we analyze whether we can explain what is driving those transfers. So 44 users are related to the same transfer, which is started in an American crypto exchange, and have feedbacks effect across the users in our data set. So we know what drove that anomalous transfer in the beginning of April in 2019. So we exclude those 44 users. We have remaining 4 users. And for those who don't have any specific market event, here you're seeing the users, dark market, services, and someone that will label and explain why. This is the amount of transfers, 100, 200, 300, 400 Bitcoins in the vicinity of 3 days before the event place. So what we do, we analyze their business model. Do they actually receive those transfers constantly, or is something really accurate? One user, which is a gateway that works as a payment, like PayPal, you can buy in an online shop with Bitcoin, and this gateway gives dollars to the online shopper, so the online shopper doesn't need to deal with the volatility of Bitcoin. That was our flagged user. So what we do, let's examine or do some forensic analysis here and see whether this user has some past transfer within their wallets with other reported crimes. And you find evidence for ransomware attacks and funding anti-government cells in Syria, which gets us close to Islamic State, which claimed the Sri Lankan Easter bombing. Now, another thing we do, the pinpoint or the flagged transfer, let's look what happens after this user received this transfer. That goes to a large crypto exchange, in which is consistent with this idea of operatives on the ground converting Bitcoin to cash or to other cryptocurrencies to finance the local operations. Now, since this is a large user, and the transfer goes to a crypto exchange, we also check the same user in other blockchains, Litecoin, Ripple, Ethereum, and Bitcoin Cash, whether there is a large inbound transfer with the same characteristics of this Bitcoin outbound transfer. And that happened a day after the Sri Lankan Easter bombing for the exact same user on Ripple blockchain. Now, there's something that's interesting about the transfer. You're looking here to the cumulative daily transfers. This is 1.5 million Ripples, is about $400,000. First, if you compare that to other cumulative daily, this one is the largest in the 5 years of existence of this wallet. And the other cumulative dailies are composed of hundreds and thousands of transfers. And this one is mostly driven by one major transfer that gets in and gets out in a span of 20 minutes. Now, because this is one large transfer and it stays in this user wallet only for 20 minutes, we are able to track this transfer one step ahead on the Ripple network. So here what happens. This is our user. The transfer goes to a mixer, the one that I explained before, that reshuffling across several transfers. And part of it goes to a user that redistributes small amounts to anonymous wallets. And other part goes to another wallet, the DD, called DD, which is an anonymous wallet, but was among the 10th richest wallets on the Ripple network. So we end up surfacing this money laundering scheme as we think it's associated with the Sri Lankan Easter bombing. So if there's more questions, I think this is a good moment to pick them.
I think you can go ahead and, Nastya, there's a question, yes.
Yep. So your discussion essentially inspired attention to another metric which you have, which is life of a wallet. So you're also saying in the paper that life of a wallet is indicative of essentially the wallets which have short life. That's much harder to trace. Have you looked at the spike of the short life wallets? So essentially to kind of support all the system, there should be some short life transactions, wallets that disappear and essentially harder to trace. Have you looked into this? Because this seems to be kind of the hiding effect, which is probably more indicative than the volumes.
Okay, yes, I think we can do that. Well, the wallets with a short lifespan, those are usually mixers wallets, right? Although we have the addresses for some of the mixers or the main mixers, there are many others that we're not able to map because this is exactly the service, right? The service is exactly making tracking Bitcoin transfers hard. So it's an empirical challenge what you're suggesting, but I like that, and I think that is interesting. I just think that perhaps with the amount of mapped wallets that we have, we want to be able to deliver some fair results. So I would have to map at least a more considerable number of mixers. So I have to think about it. But perhaps on another paper and focus on mixers, and that would be interesting. So if I don't have more questions, I would just go to the last part of the analysis.
4 minutes to wrap up, yes.
And wrap up, yeah. So I'll just give the main insights, okay? The last part of the paper is an additional analysis that we look into whether it's possible to use these insights from the previous analysis and build a machine learning model to predict terrorist attacks. So here is our blockchain-based model with an indicator for terrorist attacks. All the other variables are lagged a day, so I can predict in the next day. And we have parameters for volume, inbounds, outbounds, balance, some characteristics that's live in days, as you mentioned, and some characteristics where the transfer is coming from, or some indicative of how anomalous that transfer is. Now, we use the same user that we flagged in the vicinity of Sri Lankan Easter bombing to train the model on 70% of the data, and then validate on the other 30%. However, there are several issues here for the data generating process. For instance, most of the transfers are not related to terrorist activities, so the data is imbalanced. And so that affects the choice for the machine learning models, and also in which parametric we're going to use to evaluate the performance. So here it is. We use 3 nonlinear classifiers, supported vector machine neural networks in random forest. Here I can show you the issue of the imbalance. A naive guess that the transfer is not related to terrorist attacks is almost 100% of the time correct. So beating this mark is pretty hard. However, all the learning guess presented on a slightly better accuracy, which shows that the model is doing something. However, this may not be the best way to evaluate the model because of the imbalances on the data. So what we do, we also use all the metrics as precision, recall, and F measure, or just to illustrate the balance accuracy, which basically takes the model ability to predict an event, and that is on true outcome or yes outcome, and also no outcome, and then equally weights it. So you don't have this imbalance effect on the results. Now, a naive balance accuracy would be something in about 0.497. So let's say anything about 50% would be showing that those models are doing a better job. Now, since you are tenfold cross-validating the training set, here what you're seeing is the slice with the best performance where the random forest had a perfect score. And the reason is because supported vector machine and neural networks have too many false negatives. Now, in the validation set, with the tunneled model, we are showing the results for the random forest, but they also have consistent results for the other models too, on the same user and the 30% of the data. And here we see that a learning guess is still doing some better job than a naive guess. These results change when we apply for other users or other group of users. But the bottom line here is to show that Bitcoin blockchain data has predictive power. Of course, this is not what the agencies will do. They know which subset of wallets are terrorist associated, and so they can train and have a better performance for their models. We just want to show a simple base model that still works. So if I don't have more, should I conclude or first pick the question?
Yeah, go ahead and conclude.
All right, so we provide novel evidence that the blockchain cryptocurrencies are used to finance terrorist attacks across using event study, a forensic piece, and with machine learning. And again, our results are informative that shows, at least on the short term, transparency is not enough to curb terrorist activities. However, with this more scrutiny of the public, more research, on the long term, the regulatory demand is open to debate. We also show that essentially the terror financier has a disclosed choice when going to a blockchain-based currency that is exposing the secrecy of the attack that can be foiled. And there's a red flag that more opaque cryptocurrencies, such as Monero and Zcash, which we cannot do what we did here with Bitcoin, are likely to accommodate the demand for this terrorist financing. So the last point is that we showed that a crypto exchange is a problematic node in the system, and so regulators should approximate anti-money laundering and KYC measures to traditional banking standards. And in that sense, we provide contribution also to the debate over cryptocurrency regulations. That's it with the paper.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your presentation. So maybe another implication of your presentation is that we as editors should carefully consider whether we should publish your paper, because then the terrorists become aware of the predictability, but that's something we will have to discuss. So let's take a 15-minute break, and then we will reconvene at 11:10 Chicago time. Thank you.
Hey, Meow, are you there?
Hey, Rodrigo, I'm here.
Okay.
You hear me clearly?
Yes, yes. I think this is making you a co-host. Yeah, so you're co-host now. I'm a co-host as well.
Okay, yes. There you go. I think I can try to share this.
Yeah, so you can load these slides. Just have your first slide ready to go.
Let me make it full screen. Okay. Rodrigo, can you see my slide?
Yeah, I can see the slide. Just move ahead once. Just yeah, perfect. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see you well too. Okay, so we'll take a break now. Let's come back like a few minutes before this 12 minutes until they start. And Mel, I'm gonna say that you're not gonna respond to any chat questions, right? So I'm gonna feed all the questions to live, but no chat. So the chat will be on record later, so you can use the comments later, but not don't feel that you need to look at the chat at all.
Okay, sounds good. That's a bit more work for you, Rodrigo, though.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll figure something out. But no, don't feel responsible for the chat. That's the main thing.
That's it.
Okay. Okay, so take a quick break and regroup in like 8 minutes or so. We will start in about 2 minutes. Just give a heads up. Yeah, we're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm working on some of my body expensiveness. I'm getting ready.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So our next paper is a paper by Miao Liu from Boston College, Assessing Human Information Processing and Lending Decisions. Just FYI here, it is slightly different dynamics than what we've had the whole conference. So this is a solo auto paper. So if you want your comments to be, like your comments will be passed to Miao after the conference, but any comments on the chat will not be responsible for responding live. So I'm going to kind of be monitoring the hands a little more closely. Miao, try if you have several hands, I'll just ask you to be brief. The same for the authors. Make sure we can get more questions in person. But if you just have a comment, just put them on the chat to make sure we'll pass them after the fact. So Miao, the next hours is yours. You have full 5 minutes, and then we'll open up. Okay,
thank you very much, Rodrigo. I highly appreciate the opportunity to present this paper in this conference. I want to start by thanking Rodrigo and the reviewer for very insightful comments. In this paper, my focus is on humans, not AI. Nonetheless, I will show that AI can be a very useful tool for us to better understand humans. And specifically, I am investigating human information processing, and I'm going to use AI as a benchmark to evaluate potential weaknesses and strengths in human information processing. With this approach, I partnered with a small business lender. I will show that, well, loan officers at this lender are subject to behavioral bias and overreact to certain information relative to the AI. Such behavioral bias and overreaction also motivates loan officers to interact more with the borrowers and acquire more soft information, something that humans do better than AI. Why information processing? Hold on a sec. Okay, good. As accountants, we know the objective of financial reporting is to facilitate decision-making. However, to what extent that objective is met crucially depends on how efficiently investors process the information. To study information processing, I partnered with a small business lender in China. Loan officers at this lender have access to hard information that consists of a variety of borrower characteristics and accounting information, such as sales, inventory, and cash flows. Loan officers also have the option to acquire additional soft information, mostly by making phone calls to the borrowers. In addition, hard and soft information might interact because loan officers determine whether and how to acquire additional soft information after they see all the hard information. One very cool thing about this setting is that I got to work in the lender's office and have access to the entire hard information data that loan officers use. This allows me to study their information processing behavior very closely. And most importantly, having access to the entire hard information data allows me to train a machine learning model to make lending decisions based on the same hard information data that loan officers use. And I use this machine learning model as a benchmark to evaluate loan officers' information processing. To guide my empirical research, I find it useful to categorize theories on potential weakness in human information processing into two groups. The first is theory of cognitive constraints, recently surveyed by Blanquet-Spoor et al. In the context of accounting and finance. This theory highlights that humans can only process a subset of all useful information and allocate their attention rationally within this cognitive constraint. The second is behavioral bias theory. And the central prediction there is that even within the set of information actually used, humans tend to make systematic probabilistic errors. However, there's another line of research in accounting and finance that emphasizes that humans also have strength in acquiring new information, especially soft information, a type of information that is hard to codify, hard to verify, and hard to transmit across people without losing value. One intriguing question one might ask is that since both the human weaknesses, namely our cognitive constraints and biases, and human strength, namely our unique ability to interact and engage with other people to produce soft information, are both coded in our DNAs, can they be somehow connected? I will show you a setting where behavioral bias induces humans to overreact to certain information, and such overreaction also motivates them to go ahead and acquire more soft information. This brings me to an overview of my results. First, I trained a machine learning model on borrowers' hard information and showed that this model substantially outperforms loan officers in processing hard information. Then I use this model as a benchmark to assess loan officers' limitations and biases in processing hard information. I show that loan officers can only process a small subset of all useful information identified by the machine learning model. This is consistent with the prediction of the cognitive constraint theory. Loan officers also overreact to salient information, such as large jumps in cash flows. They put weights on such information much higher than what the machine learning model would suggest. However, I also find that loan officers produce more soft information after they see salient hard information. For example, they are more likely to make phone calls after they see salient hard information. And when they do make phone calls, they talk longer. This result suggests that salience has a dual role. On the one hand, it creates bias in loan officers' hard information processing by attracting too much attention to it. But at the same time, it motivates loan officers to acquire more soft information by signaling where to pay attention. It suggests that human weakness in processing hard information is connected with their strength in acquiring soft information.
Hey, Miao, now might be a good time to open up for questions. So Anna.
Hi, Miao. Great paper. I really enjoyed reading it. My question for you is about the setting that you're going to use. And in particular, it seems that there are some peculiarities about this setting that make it unlike most other lending settings that I've seen. So, for example, you say on the front page that these decision makers, these lenders, don't use any sort of tool. They don't have access to, historical data. They don't use any internal rating models. They don't rely on third-party credit ratings. And so, when you horse race this and sort of, put it against a machine-based model, I'm just frankly not very surprised that the machine model outperforms the human, because it seems that the loan officer here is just really limited in terms of not being able to use any tool whatsoever. So a little bit of question about, how this relates to other lending settings. And then additionally, it seems that the lenders don't have incentive. These aren't relationship loans, so they don't really have incentives to collect soft information as much as they do in other lending settings. So have you thought about how your setting can speak to the broader literature in lending on how loan officers trade off this, hard information versus soft information?
Okay, thanks for the questions, Jana. So you have two questions. One is about the available tools for the loan officers to aid their decision. You're right, there's very limited tool for the loan officers. They don't have internal credit ratings. They don't have external credit ratings from a third party because this is a lender, very young lender, founded in a very young market. There was no third-party credit rating on the market during my sample period. And since the lender just founded in 2011, they didn't have historical data for them to develop internal credit rating. So in a sense, this is an ideal setting for me to analyze human decision-making because all the decisions are based completely on human judgment. But on the other hand, you are right that it's not surprising that a sophisticated machine learning model would outperform loan officers. So I don't think that's a surprising finding of my paper. Rather, I use that as a starting point to say, okay, now we have a good benchmark, which is this machine learning model to help us evaluate human decision errors. So for your second question, yes, this lending setting, we don't expect soft information plays a big role. This is not a relationship-based business. So this is both a strength and a weakness of the setting. The strength is because relationship-based lending is not in the business model. I can, that will give me more confidence to say that loan officers, they try to maximize profit for each individual loan instead of trying to, aim at forming a long-term relationship. But also the downside is that, soft information plays a limited role in this setting. So I can't, all my finding about soft information production, I would say it's more qualitative nature than quantitative if you want to bring that to other settings. I hope that answers the questions.
Yeah, I would just, emphasize that this is, a paper about testing these cognitive constraints using lending as a setting, and not so much that we're learning about the role of hard and soft information in lending more broadly, but still really interesting.
Points well taken. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, let's move to Regina.
Yeah, of course, I really like the paper, very close to my research interest. I would say I struggle with two issues in the paper, and the first is very similar to what Anna mentioned. Just to add to what she said, the setting is even more unique because loan officers cannot determine interest rate, it's fixed. Maturity is given by the top managers. Loan officers don't monitor after the loan is issued, and the borrowers don't even come back. So the setting is very unique, and it should be explained in the paper what we exactly can learn in terms of at least private lending, because I haven't seen anything like that in any other private lending literature. My other struggle with the paper was your behavioral explanation for why loan officers reach for soft information. Seek soft information. I'm definitely not behavioral experts. We have a lot of behavioral experts in the audience that can probably understand it better, but I actually felt it's very rational because you say that loan officers overreact to salient information and then we see them seeking soft information. To me, it's actually very rational. It means that they understand that there's the outliers that should be explained. And given that these are outliers, they pick up the phone and call the borrower to collect more information. So I wasn't sure why you emphasize the behavioral aspect of that and overreaction, because to me, it's not overreaction, it's very rational behavior. Generally, the loan officer in the setting seem to be very rational to me. They look at 50 financial ratios, which is surprising, right? They only can determine the size. They look at 50. I think this is what prior research showed that rating agencies do. So they behave pretty well given all the constraints. And I'm just curious why you emphasize behavioral aspect.
Okay, thanks for the questions, Regina. Your first question is very related to what Anna just said. It's a point well taken. So let me respond to your second one. Actually, I completely agree with whatever you just said. What I'm trying to document here is that there are two parts of what the loan officers do in their decision making. One is they overreact to salient information relative to what the AI model suggests them. But the other side of this coin is that they rationally go out and acquire more soft information. So the overreaction to the hard information, that's what I mean by the behavioral bias. But because of that bias, it motivates loan officers to rationally allocate their attention to acquire soft information. That's nothing behavioral. I agree with you that it is completely rational. And in fact, in this little model I have in the appendix, it is a completely rational model to explain why overreaction to hard information induces loan officers to acquire more soft information rationally.
I was just not sure if it's the right term to call it overreaction, because they rationally seek for more information, but I would like other people who are better experts in behavioral studies to probably comment on that.
Thank you.
Let's go to Stephen Kirschmeyer then. That's a good one.
I certainly don't know, Regina, that I would characterize myself as somewhat a better expert, but I do behavioral experiments. And I got to tell you now that this paper brought me back to my roots, a strong sense of deja vu, because when I was a PhD student in the mid 80s, we read lots of articles with titles almost exactly like yours, human information processing, and somewhat ironically, often in the context of lending decisions, even going back to Bob Libby's dissertation from the mid 1970s. And you acknowledge this, but you acknowledge it very briefly. It's in footnote 6, and you say there's this deeper, older literature. But I think you need to do better than footnote 6 on this. I mean, there is a deep literature that compares how humans process information, and by the way, also how humans select information cues, as compared to how machines process and select information cues. And there are advantages of machines and computer models, both in processing and in selection. And so, I mean, your opening sentence here this morning was, this is a paper about human information processing and not about AI. If you mean that, you need to, I think, position this paper more effectively within the human information processing literature that, again, dates back to the 1970s and 80s. Look, for example, at a literature review by Libby and Lewis from 1982, which talks about the various combinations of information processing and selection with respect to accuracy. I do think, so I don't sound too critical here, I do think you have some important incremental contributions. For starters, this whole idea of cognitive biases and overweighting hard information might lead to advantages in acquiring soft information, the phone call kind of thing. That's new, and that's important. I also think you have an advantage in nonlinear weighting that you can get from machine learning, from AI, that you couldn't get from the linear models that were constructed from the 70s and 80s. But that being said, many of these points that you're raising in this paper were raised in the 1970s and 80s. And I would advise, for example, going to Google Scholar and just typing in human information processing lending decisions, type in those terms. And besides your dissertation, you're going to see lots of stuff that is quite relevant to this paper.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. I will work on that.
Okay, let's get one more question, then let's move a little bit of the presentation. So Mark Pitcher.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll just follow up on Steve. First of all, a lot of the literature was motivated because experts, so-called experts in human judgment, said that they were using nonlinear combinations of cues, and what people like Robin Dawes and others showed was that really you could model that judgment based just on putting in main effects and adding them up. So one thing I would be very interested in your paper is that you do, Meow, seem to treat all of the human lenders equally, and you have 80 or so lenders, and it may be the case that some of them are better at nonlinear combinations of the variables. And I noticed, at least when I was reading the paper, that I didn't see where in your modeling of the human judgment that you added interaction variables, or for example, used polynomial regression to look for the use of nonlinear weighting. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the linear weights still show up, because a lot of humans say they process information nonlinearly, but don't. And so you still might get that, but I'd be very interested in not looking at all of 80 as the same type of human information processor, but maybe look at quartiles or terciles of the lenders and see if you have some lenders who come closer to using, and also be your results about how many variables do they use. It may be that adding more variables helps, but it also may be adding more variables hurts, because it's a cost benefit with your cognitive constraints. So I'll turn it over to you. I don't want to take too much time.
Well,
interesting
I totally
paper.
agree. Thank you, so thank you very much. I totally agree with what you said. I have a one graph in a later slide that slightly touched on what you just said, but I can definitely do more.
Okay, Meow, why don't you take a few minutes, push the presentation a little bit more, and then we'll circle back to add the hand, but let's give the next 5 minutes.
All right, so I see this paper contributes to 3 strands of literature. First, it provides new insights into the literature on investors' information processing. And again, I differentiate between cognitive constraint theory and behavioral bias theory. These 2 theories are often studied and tested separately and considered as competing theories to explain the same market phenomena. My finding on the dual role of salient information bridges these 2 lines of research. While salience creates bias in hard information processing, as predicted by the behavioral bias theory, it facilitates the allocation of attention to acquire soft information, and attention is a costly resource emphasized by the cognitive constraint theory. This new results highlights the value of combining both kinds of models together to further our understanding of human decision-making. Second, here are my first 2 commenters. My paper contributes to the literature on soft and hard information and their differing roles in loan contracts. And these are the 2 very closely related studies. Campbell et al. Document that human has limitations and biases that might impede soft information production. Costello et al. Find in a randomized experiment that adding private soft information into a machine-based credit score improves loan outcomes. My paper complements these 2 studies by focusing on how human limitations hamper hard information processing and how bias in processing hard information can motivate soft information acquisition. And finally, my paper contributes to this nascent literature studying how advances in AI are transforming the financial markets. It is well established that machines have an advantage over humans in tasks with large digital data sets and well-defined outputs. This goes back to Anna's previous point. But the focus of my paper is to go one step further by searching for factors explaining human underperformance in such tasks. And in addition, I document that humans have strengths relative to machines in acquiring soft information and show how these strengths can be facilitated somehow by human bias. So let me go a little bit deeper into my setting. I partnered with this small business lender in China that operates in 23 major cities, and I have access to their entire history of business operation. The average loan size in my setting, converting to US dollars, is about 8,000, very small loans, and the maturity is between 1 and 2 years, so very short-term loans. The profits of the lender, defined by the total repayment minus the size of the loan divided by the size of the loan, that's 15.6%. And there are more than 50,000 loans in my sample made by more than 50 loan officers. As Regina previously pointed out, one unique feature of this market is that interest rate and fees are fixed for all borrowers. The reason for that is, turned out in this very small, high-risk business lending market, borrowers or credit demands are much more sensitive to the quantity margin than the price margin. This is the feature of this market in China, but it is also a feature in the similar markets in the US, South Africa, and the UK.
Now, that might be a good, maybe you'll finish this slide and let's get a few questions. We have 7 people waiting there in the queue.
Sounds good. Loan officers in my setting, they make 2 decisions. First, they decide whether to grant or reject a borrower. And second, conditionally on granting the loan, they determine the size of the loan. And again, as a newly founded company in 2011, in a very young market, the lender does not have historical data. They don't have internal credit model or credit rating from a third party to aid loan officers in making decisions. As a result, loan officers' decisions are entirely based on their personal judgment. Rodrigo, I'm ready for more questions.
So at the hand.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, super interesting paper. And in the spirit of costly processing, I'm sorry if some stuff's in there and I didn't get through it all. There's a lot going on, but I also didn't have the model at hand. So, but as I was reading the paper, something that struck me is, for me anyway, when I think about rational inattention, it's almost always in relation to some budget constraint, that I've got a limited amount of time as an officer. And and then you also need to think about things in terms of portfolios, right? So it's like I could spend more time on this individual loan, but it's more efficient for me to just spend less time here so I can get to 3 or 4 more other loans. So I was wondering how you thought about that. And then I think on page 32, I think it mentions that you might have like time data, like how long they spend on each individual loan. And one place where this becomes particularly important is how you operationalize salience. Because if I see that a signal has got a sort of large variance from the exemplar in the Bordalo model sense, then it could be very costly for me to reduce the variance of my interpretation of that signal. So picking up the phone is super rational because I can just get that person to sort of tell me where to start. So I know there's a lot in there, but how do you think about the budget constraint? Do you have data on time? And how might your results be interpreted differently if you looked at the whole portfolio and overall profitability of the manager?
Okay, so let me try to respond to your question 2 ways. One is absolutely this attention is something that all rational bounded rationality model have in their budget constraint or attention constraint. So it's definitely attention is a very, very limited and costly constraints for all loan officers. I do have the amount of time they spend on each loan, and on average is, I think it's a little bit more than an hour. So it's very fast decision making. And you're right that because this attention is a constraint, it gives every humans a trade-off. And AI or machine doesn't really have that trade-off. So I think, one big reason that AI outperforms some officers is that they don't have this trade-off. In terms of your point on the overall portfolio management, I haven't thought about that a lot, and I need to think a little bit more. So far, my one big assumption in this paper is that loan officers, they try to maximize profits for each individual loan. And they're not trying to maximize the portfolio of loans they have. I think that's not a crazy assumption because at this lender, all the borrowers are randomly assigned to loan officers. They don't get to really need to worry about their portfolio is probably more tilted to one market versus others or one industry versus others. But I got to think about your comment a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah, Ed, do you want to get back to that?
I was just to conclude, I think that is a pretty important assumption, because if they can only process 10 loans versus 20, their compensation could be directly affected. So I would give that some thought.
Okay, let's get 2 more questions, but also save time for the presentation. Let's try to keep questions and answer a bit briefer, if that's okay. Jan?
Thank you. Yeah, great paper. Thank you for presenting this. My question is about, how much do these loan officers really care about making the right decision? You described their, the extent to which their compensation is dependent on the fact of how well they perform in terms of the loans. But how fair is that compared to the number of loans that they agree on, right? So, is there sufficient, is there a sufficient number of borrowers that would actually justify why you would actually look at their performance in terms of their loans to incentivize them? So how fair is that?
So the loan officer's compensation has a fixed salary part and a bonus part. The bonus part is a function. This is what I know from talking to the managers, as a function of the revenue they generate, not the pure size of the loan they generate. So that's one thing. And second, their promotion prospect also is a function of the revenue they generate. So in general, I think loan officers care a lot about the revenues, not just about the size.
But why would they care then about the quality of their decisions? That is basically my point, right?
Well, because presumably the quality of the decision is possibly correlated with revenues.
Why is that?
Because you want to lend more money to borrowers who are more likely to repay you.
But if you're okay, thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's one more question from Miguel, and then let's go back to some slides.
Hello. I really like your paper. A few things I think already came up in the chat is that perhaps you want to not change the term overreaction, but explain early in the paper that overreaction refers to overweight, right? Overweight of the officer versus a rule. Now, here you have to be sort of a little bit more agnostic that the rule that you use is the best rule. You're just using what I think is a reasonable rule, right? So, because machine learning and all of these models do not pretend to find the causal effect. They just pretend to find the best aggregation of signals that produce the most accurate prediction, right? So perhaps you need to be a little bit more skeptical about that. And then I will not do it, but perhaps include some OLS also as a benchmark. But my own experience is that these things tend to be very similar. And then finally, what a lot of people want to know is the combined effect. So basically 3 things: overreaction versus overweight. What is it that the ML model gives you? And finally, the combined. Thanks.
Okay. So I do have some results using OLS, which I will elaborate more later. And in terms of the your overweight comments, I'm not, just to clarify, I'm not using any weights I get from the ML and call that correct weight. Instead, I'm testing if loan officers are more likely to make mistakes when there are salient information showing up without really looking at the exact weights they put on the salient information. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, well, but at the end, that's what people want to know, right? What signals are better understood by a machine model versus a human, right? Not to cover, like a lot of these arguments, I also made them in my going concern paper, which is a rehash of about a lot of these 70s papers, where we compare the auditor versus a machine in giving going concern opinions. So it's sort of the same idea, but people eventually want to know what is it that humans are not getting. Maybe
that's a hard question. But
yeah, very hard one.
yeah, I would love to learn more about this paper that you're writing.
Okay, Mel, so why don't you take a few minutes, just push the presentation a bit, like 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll circle back to Shugata.
Sounds good. Okay, these are some of the variables that are available to loan officers. On the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, we have demographic information about the borrowers. They pretty much self-explain themselves. On the right-hand side, we have some accounting information, such as information about the buyers of the borrowers, suppliers, accounts receivable, account payable inventory. These are information collected by what I call field employees that the lender sent to the borrower stores. And they gotta collect all this information. And finally, we have cash flow type of information that the lender got from the borrower's bank statements. And this is a information flow at this level. First, a borrower comes in and filed a application, and the lender had a system to randomly assign this borrower to one of these loan officers. And there are two types of information loan officers use. On the left, we have hard information, and on the right, we have what I call soft information. These are type of information that loan officers got from either pictures taken by the field employees when they visit the borrower's stores, pictures about the borrower's, inventory, business receipts, etc. And loan officers have the option to make phone calls to the borrowers, family members, co-workers, etc. And based on these two types of information, loan officer will make a decision, loan size. Two important features of this setting that helped me to design my research. One, I observed the entire information set the loan officers use. And two, borrowers are randomly assigned. Why random assignment is important is because if we see differences in loan officers' decision process, it can be due to two reasons. The first is that they process the same information differently. The second is that they are just dealing with different types of borrowers. And this random assignment helps me a lot to rule out this second case so that I can focus on studying information processing. Well, I think, because I use machine learning models extensively, I think it is useful to discuss what machine learning models are and why they can be powerful. In my setting, I'm interested in predicting borrowers' repayment. Call that Y. And I have borrower characteristics as data. Call that X. Machine learning is essentially a data-driven approach to find out the function F that has the best predicting power out of sample. So when a new borrower comes in, it will give us a good estimate of the borrower's repayment prospect. The power of machine learning models comes from its ability to capture nonlinear feature of the data. And his is a oversimplified example, but I think it conveys the key intuition. So in this example, the machine learning model first searches the single variable that has the most predictive power over borrower repayment. Suppose that is the borrower's education. If the borrower has a college degree, it is extremely likely that he or she will repay in full. In that case, the algorithm will just stop there. On the other hand, if the borrower does not have a college degree, the algorithm will just search for the second most predicting variable. Say that is the borrower's industry. And based on these two characteristics, education and industry, the sample of borrowers is divided into three categories. The predicted repayment of a new borrower in the holdout sample who falls into, say, category I is set to equal to the average repayment of borrowers in the training sample in that category I. So this example shows the intuition of how machine learning models capture nonlinear feature of the data. How much a borrower's industry predicts repayments depends on whether the borrower has a college degree. OLS does not capture this interactive feature unless we put in an interaction between education and industry. But without strong theoretical reasons to guide us which interactions to put in the OLS model, well, the number of potentially useful interactions will pretty soon exceed the number of observations, making this exercise infeasible computationally. So this is the power of machine learning model. And now I think it's a good point to stop.
Yeah, Miao, you have 22 minutes. So let's get a couple questions and then see some of the results. So Shugara.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I mean, I'm not sure. I apologize, Miao. This was triggered by an earlier slide, so the question is may not be relevant to what you're talking about right now. But I just wanted to say you might want to be careful relying on the salience bias from Kahneman as a motivating alternative mechanism, because in Kahneman, what you call soft information is subjective information in the Kahneman framework. And in that framework, so the acquisition of subjective information triggered by salience bias is itself subject to salience bias, because the error gets compounded because decision makers tend to reaffirm their priors. So either you take some of the suggestions in the chat, and Miguel was talking about some of this, and step away from this Kahneman framework, or you realize that you're taking it on. You're taking on the Kahneman framework, because in your and I'd be nervous about that. So that's sort of my comment, and so that's something you might want to keep in mind, thinking about the acquisition of soft information is just a rational response, like Regina and Anna made this point already. That might be a better way to go.
Thank you, Sugata. There's something deep in the comment. I like it. Thank you.
Yeah, Dav.
Great. Thanks, Rodrigo. And Miao, I found your paper very interesting. One thing that I had in mind when I was reading through your paper, and the slide that you have up is at a great point to talk about this, is that loan officers can learn about borrowers after they experience default events, or they can learn about a borrower from looking at different borrowers in their portfolio. And the example that I had in my mind was Justin Murfin's JF paper from about 10 years ago. Could you talk a little bit more about to what extent the machine learning approach can help incorporate this sort of portfolio information, and how that kind of facilitates the benchmark that you're using in this paper?
Okay. Turned out loan officers in my, they don't seem to learn from history about the potential biases they have. I have an exercise in the appendix where I group loan officers by their experience, and turned out officers with longer experience, they are more subject to the salient bias in the sample. Why that's the case, I think that's outside of the paper, but at least I can show you that learning doesn't really is a big factor that can explain some of these results.
Yeah, let's see some tables here and then circle back to John. So go straight to what you did.
Okay, so before we see tables, I have one more slide because I need to tell you the research design. Okay, so in my research, I'm interested in evaluating loan officers' decision. Call that loan size H, where H represents humans. And I observe the loan outcome. But to evaluate this decision, I need a benchmark that tells me what the correct decision should be. Well, such a benchmark is easily available in a laboratory setting. It is usually absent in the real world. To solve this challenge, I train a machine learning model, M, based on borrower's hard information data, X. And I ask the machine learning model to make a prediction on repayment. Then, based on this prediction, I ask the machine learning model to make a machine-based decision, called that loan size M. If the outcome of this machine-based decision is substantially better than the outcome of the human decision, this machine learning model can be a good benchmark to evaluate potential errors in loan officers' decision in terms of their hard information processing. However, there's one more challenge I need to solve, which is this. Loan officers use both hard and soft information in their decision-making, but machine has only access to the hard information. So to make an apple-to-apple comparison, I need to decompose loan officer's decision into a part driven by hard information processing, called that H of X, and a part driven by soft information acquisition, called that S. To do this, I train a second set of machine learning models, but this time not to predict borrower repayment, but to predict each loan officer's decision. And I allow different officers to have different H, and train a machine learning model for each officer J to predict her decision. Call that HJX. The purpose of this is to mimic each officer's behavior in processing hard information. And importantly, this H function should capture any limitation or bias that officer J might have in processing hard information. And I recover soft information S as the difference between the actual decision and this H function. Now, we have some tables. First, I need to show you that the performance of this machine learning model is better than the loan officers. Here, the first column is what the human outcome is. That's the 15.6% profit that we observe in the data. The third column is the machine learning model's performance. Based on machine decisions, the lender can generate a 21.5% profit, which is 38% higher than what loan officers generate. And as a comparison, if we do machine learning using OLS, it doesn't outperform loan officers. So this highlights the power of machine learning model comes from their ability to capture interactive feature of the data. With that, I first test the cognitive constraint theory. In this graph, each bar represents a performer. Performer 0 at the bottom is the machine learning model, and every other bar is a loan officer. The length of each bar captures how many variables are used by each performer in a linear fashion. To get these bars, I regress either the machine learning model or each of the mimic models for loan officers on the entire set of borrower characteristics using OLS forward stepwise selection procedure. So you can see from this graph that the machine learning model finds for all these 205 available variables, 147 variables are useful to predict loan outcomes. But in contrast, loan officers only use between 25 to 56 with an average of 42 of these variables in their decisions. And this graph on the right, each bar is the R-square associated with the linear regression in the left-hand side graph. So each bar in the right-hand side, these red bars, measures how linear each performer's model is. So you can see the 147 variables that the machine learning model uses explains 66% of the variation in its predictions. The much smaller set of variables that loan officers use explain a much larger portion of the variation in their decisions, ranging from 83% to 92%, with an average of 88. This finding suggests that while loan officers process information in a linear fashion, the machine learning model captures a remarkable nonlinear and interactive feature of the data that contains useful signals of borrower's risk. Now I'm gonna, I guess I'm not gonna move on.
Yeah, let's get a couple questions to John Barrios and Regina, and then you push a little bit more.
Sounds good.
John?
Yeah, 2 points. Like, just to reiterate, I think the use of just framing this as discretion versus non-discretion, using like the machine as being the benchmark non-discretionary component, right? Where you just use all the observables and then kind of tease out what would be potential reasons for the deviations might be a little bit softer to push the paper through versus taking a hard stance right away of the behavioral, right? Just kind of like the Hoffman paper on the employee decisions, right? Where they do the machine race between an AI and a manager, and are they hiring better people or not than the machine, right? And then the second question, which is more, the first was a comment. The second is, how do we think about equity here? Because the benchmark that you set up is basically saying like, yeah, we could use the machines and the machines have a better predictive ability. And we could do that in the US. And kind of to Anya's point, we also see that better predictive might come with underinvestments for females, minorities, because these covariates are related to other features that, yes, are correlated with performance of these borrowers. But as a society, we kind of said, we don't want to use those loadings, even though they're profitable. Right. So do you think of that because I don't see any talk of that in the paper, and it's kind of meant like, look, there's bias against this perfect machine, but there's also this equity cost that do we care about that? Do you care about that? Or do you think that doesn't, in the paper, I just didn't.
Well, I think as people, we all care about that. But in terms of the scope of the paper, I think, this potential equity issues is not the focus of the paper, although I do have an exercise to show in the appendix that, turned out in this setting, machines would do better in terms of lending to women than loan officers. So even though I had to train the machine using human-generated data, and there is bias in this data inevitably. But turned out, if I train the machine using this data, well, the machine can do a better job in terms of reducing at least the gender discrimination in my setting. But that's the focus of the paper.
But you mean providing more lending opportunities to women, or getting women to repay at higher rates than men?
No, lending more money to women.
Okay.
To at least to women who are worthwhile, are less risk identified by the machine.
Regina?
Yeah, I feel a bit of a disconnect between the institutional setting and a few of the questions you're asking. And I think there are two parts. First, I think the bank, you said you create an impression, this is not create an impression, but the paper is written in a way that it's very new bank. They don't have a lot of experience, but they do have access to the central bank. They have entire information on the credit history, which is like as good as it gets. It's like equivalent to US Credit Bureau. So these loan officers are pretty informed. They have all prior delinquencies and defaults and all outstanding lines of credit. And second, also, I think you underdevelop or underrelate to very specific incentive structure here is that they are compensated by revenues, and they charge extremely high interest rate at 16%. So to me, given all that, they behave as rationally as I would expect any loan officers to behave. They charge 16%, they compensated by the total revenue. And even if some of these loans default, because they are also promoted quickly, it's a new institution and based on revenue, they may not be even in this position of the loan officer that gave the loan to be evaluated on defaults. So what they do, they look at the rich set of data from the central bank. They know all the prior default, they know a little bit of information from how they operate, which is well inside of there are 40, 50 variables you think that they use. They make a quick decision, as Ed mentioned, they have very limited time during the day, and you said they spend 1 hour and they move on. So to me, it's very rational behavior, and I think maybe you should incorporate more in the paper, the setting, and also look at some other papers. There are a few very important papers on loan officers' incentives and compensation that may tie well in your setting, and maybe it will improve how you relate your very specific setting to your analysis.
Thank you, Regina. That's a lot of information to.
Sorry.
But I will go back to everything you just said. And let me just react to one thing. I agree with you because loan officers have very limited time for each decision. On average, not much more than an hour. So I would believe a big part of the potential bias they have is because they don't have much time to process all the available information they have. So, I think it's an intrinsic human feature that there's an interaction between cognitive constraints and all the bias that we have. And, it's not, at least it's not easy to completely set them apart because they are intrinsically interact in our brain.
Yeah, you have 7 minutes, so I'm going to present a couple more results and then we'll circle back to Jan.
Perfect. This is a test on the behavioral bias story. And in particular, this is a test of a large class of behavioral bias model called the representativeness, which predicts that humans overreact to salient information, such as large jumps in cash flows, because such information catches the eye. Here, the dependent variable is an indicator that equals 1 if loan officers rank a borrower at least 1 decile away from the machine learning model's ranking of that borrower. And the main right-hand side variable, salience, is an indicator that equals 1 if there's at least 1 accounting variable whose value falls into 5% left tail of that variable across all borrowers. And the results of this table suggest that loan officers are about 28% more likely to misrank when they observe salient information in borrowers' accounting variables. And finally, I test how salient information affects soft information acquisition. I split the sample into a subsample with borrowers who have salient information and another subsample without. And I regress profits of each loan on how much soft information is acquired for that loan. And the table shows that soft information produced on the salient subsample has stronger predictive power on loan repayments, as shown by both the magnitude of the coefficients and the R-squared. And why would salient information impede hard information processing, but motivates loan officers to acquire more soft information? I have a theoretical model in the appendix offering an explanation, but the intuition is quite simple. Making a phone call to a borrower with very jumpy cash flows and asking the borrower to explain the jumps tells the loan officer a lot about the riskiness of the borrower. Then making a phone call to another borrower with very smooth cash flows and asking the borrower to explain the smoothness. So let's
before you conclude, so get a few hands there. Ian?
Sounds good.
Thank you, Rico. Yes, so I was wondering about how hard is this hard information and how informative is this about future payments? Given the promotions that these people make, is it not very likely that they do want to make sure that revenues come in, at early stages, but they care less about later stages because they will have been promoted by that time. So I was wondering, so how hard is this information in the first place? Because that is going to affect your model. And the second is, how likely is it that these people care about early, making sure that the borrowers can pay that use early, but care less about their later payments? Thanks.
I need to think a little bit more about your first question, but to respond to your second one, all these loans are very, very short term, between 1 and 2 years. And I think the average maturity is definitely less than 1.5 years. So loan officers, when they think about their promotion prospect, I don't think they have a very strong incentive just to make sure borrowers repay in the short term, but not the long term, because we don't really have a long term here.
Thanks.
Who's talking?
Yeah, I'm a little curious about whether you're not prejudicing the human in the sense that we concern ourselves when lending about black swan events, these extreme events. And I wonder if you have a sufficient time series of data to properly evaluate the probability distribution of default, in the sense that because of the experience that these loan officers have, they might well be more concerned about the clustering of defaults across clients and so forth that you're not identifying. And so absent a long sample, I wonder if you're not artificially prejudicing the loan officers.
Well, I need to think a little bit more on that. I agree with you that I don't have a long sample. I have 4 years in my sample period, although again, all the loans are very short term. So I can have meaningful time series variation in terms of repayment, default, etc. So I think I can definitely do something along the lines that you just suggested.
Yeah, why don't you take the next couple minutes just to wrap up?
Okay, so to conclude, efficient financial reporting requires efficient information processing. And this paper, I try to develop a framework to evaluate human information processing using machine learning models as a benchmark. I find that loan officers, they can only process a subset of all useful information identified by the machine learning model, and they overreact to salient hard information relative to what the machine learning model would suggest. However, loan officers, they go out and acquire more soft information after they observe salient hard information. This suggests that salient information have a dual role. It creates bias in hard information processing by attracting too much of loan officers' attention. But at the same time, it motivates loan officers to interact and engage more with the borrowers to acquire more soft information, because salient essentially serves as a signal for officers to allocate their attention. It suggests that human weakness in processing hard information is connected with their strength in acquiring soft information. While loan officers are subject to behavioral bias and overreact or putting too much weight to salient information relative to the AI, such overreaction also motivates them to acquire more soft information, something that humans do better than AI. Thank you very much. I appreciate all the comments.
Thanks so much, Miao. Thanks so much, all the participants. So we'll take a 10-minute break and regroup at 12:20 Chicago time.
Hey, Meow. You're still big on my screen, so that's why I'm saying hi to you.
Hi, can you hear me, Christian?
Yeah, I can. Well done.
Oh, thanks. Whew. This is great. I think,
presenting is always a bit stressful. So
yeah, I was worried about I thank you. I was worrying about my energy because, I had a lot of things going on in my teaching at this point.
Was all good.
Yeah, coffee definitely helped.
So let me make sure. G-Way, we're getting your slides, so this is good. G-Way, are you in principle ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, I'll make one quick announcement while everybody is chiming back in, and then hand it over to you. So as it is 12:19 on my computer, let me make just one quick announcement. As a small addendum to what Haresh was saying yesterday, the authors and referees are sort of the lifeblood of the journal. And one of the changes that we made that we wanted to make you aware is, as Haresh was saying, it's very difficult for us each year to pick, the reviewer of the year, or this year, the 3 people, because we have such an excellent pool of reviewers. And so we also introduced, and we'll post this starting in June, that we're now recognizing a broader set of our reviewers that do an excellent job year after year. So each year we'll recognize a larger set of reviewers if they're agree to being publicly announced on the website. And one aspect of this new regime that we like about it is that it usually takes some time until you're further in your career and you become maybe an associate editor or an editor, but a lot of the heavy load is often carried by the junior faculty sort of early on in their careers. And so one of the things that's nice is by being able to sort of recognize that larger slate is show how many of the young scholars in the field are contributing in a very important way to our profession. So that's something that we're excited about. the list will be based on the reviewing in the prior year. And so in that sense, there will be more variation from year to year, as it somewhat depends on the flow of the journals, who we tap. And so our hope is that over time, we get to recognize many and all of our excellent reviewers. So with that, thank you again to all of you who review and support JAR. And let's get to the last but not least important session, which is a paper by Shi Chen, Tony Cho, Yiwei Du, and Baruch Leff. Yiwei, take it away.
Thank you, Christian. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the editors for including our paper, and thank the reviewers, associate editors for extremely helpful comments that significantly improved the paper. So this is a joint work with my colleagues at NYU Stern. Shi Chen is from the Technology Operation and Statistics Department. Tony is our third-year PhD student. And I think Baruch Leff needs no introduction. So if you take a look at this paper's abstract and my prior work, you will notice there's nothing in common. I didn't do anything on fundamental analysis, machine learning, or even XBRL reporting. Just 2 years ago, I started to teach a new prep data analytics course to master students in accounting. So I have to teach logistic regressions, machine learning in R. I have to teach XBRL reporting. And I also ask students to do some basic fundamental analysis. So at that time, Tony was my TA. So we started to think about how to apply machine learning to this important topic, fundamental analysis. So we team up with Shi and Baruch, and we wrote this paper. It has been an incredible journey for me to learn about this new technology in statistics and also in accounting financial reporting. So we really look forward to your comments and feedback. As we all know, there are a lot of numerous quantitative accounting items, informations in corporate financial reports that include numbers on financial statements and numbers in footnotes disclosures. In ballpark, maybe hundreds of them from financial statement and thousands of them from footnotes disclosures. So understanding to what extent those detailed financial information help to predict corporate performance is important to both academics and investment practitioners. Well, despite the importance, we see a little study examining the usefulness of the entire detailed financial information, and this is the focus of our paper. So examining the usefulness of this entire detailed financial reports poses two challenges. The first one is the high dimensionality of those data sets. So very often we have the number of independent variables, also known as predictors, is greater than the number of observations. So the traditional regression approach will break down. It won't work. The way we deal with this in the prior literature was basically turns to a small set of selected ratios and then examine those ratios. This is basically the O and the Penman's approach. However, it will be unclear that how much information that were lost if you're not using the entire data set about this detailed financial information. The second challenge is about scalability. So this commercial data vendors typically only collect a part of those detailed financial information. So a lot of items, footnote disclosures, also even some items on the financial statements are not collected by those commercial data vendors. So if you want to do research on that, you have to manually collect it by yourself from the financial statement, from the financial reports, or you have to hire an army to help you do that for you. So the problem is that for a large scale analysis, the cost is non-trivial. So in this paper, we address the first challenges by using machine learning algorithms. In that algorithm, basically, it has some technique to reduce dimensionality, and this methodology do not require a sufficient number of observations relative to the number of coefficients you want to uncover. And then to address the second challenge, we're going to take advantage of these financial reports in XBRL format. So my following presentation will be centered around these two key issues, machine learning and XBRL financial reporting. And then I will talk about our methodology, and then I will turn to the results.
Maybe now is a good point in time to get two of the questions in. So Eric and then Thomas.
Sure.
Anyway, enjoyed reading your paper and thinking about this issue. I've seen a number of papers in a very similar vein across accounting and finance over the past couple of years. And so whenever I see them like presented at a conference, they're typically like two bits of discussion that come up, or sort of two related thoughts. The first is the extent to which you're really sort of surprised, or what whether there's a credible null to the idea that by using machine learning and combining this information, that we wouldn't be able to generate a forecast that better predicts, which kind of begs the question about, like, is this a methodology paper, a conceptual paper? And the second sort of related type of discussion is just, given the nature of the machine learning algorithm, what can we actually say conceptually, either about like the presentation of financial statements or like the way that investors process information, to say something a bit more concrete? And so I guess I would be curious to hear your thoughts, one, on whether you view your paper as conceptual versus methodological, and more broadly, how you view how your paper fits relative to some of these related papers.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eric. Thank you for this comments. So I think we view this paper as both about methodology and concept, in the sense that, yes, we want to introduce this methodology, machine learning, to overcome those issues and examine the usefulness of this data. And second, we want to understand the source of this superior performance. So I think that's kind of the key elements of our paper. We want to understand where those superior performance comes from, right? Is this because the model flexibility? Is that because we're using more data in this analysis? So we wanted to say something about that. Or let's say for the financial reports, how important is the financial statement? How important is the funnel disclosure? Can you give some sort of a quantification of the importance of each element? So without doing this, analyzing the entire detailed financial data, we won't be able to answer this type of questions.
So Yue, I'm sympathetic to that point. It just seems like the possible set of permutations of different machine learning techniques that one could use to apply is seemingly sort of infinite when you start to think about different models versus inputs versus parameters. And so if you view your paper as being methodological in spirit, it may be helpful in thinking about how to sort of guide researchers on the selection of these inputs, and just thinking about whether you're optimally choosing along these lines, or you've simply found one that seems to work well.
Okay, so thank you, Eric. Yes, so we try to be transparent on the parameters we chose, or that were, eventually chosen by the algorithm. And we also have some discussion about that, say, how you should choose some of the parameters regarding, the number of trees, regarding number of variables it should be selected. Yes, we wanted to be transparent and, give more guidance for the, let's say, subsequent work on this new methodology. Thank you.
Thomas.
Hey, Yue, I really enjoyed reading the paper. I think it's also kind of a very important and kind of worthwhile exercise, kind of to think about these things, a bit related to Eric's point. So when I read the paper, essentially, I felt like there's two things going on in terms of where you want to go, right? There's this part about really the methodological kind of innovation and contribution, and which aspects of machine learning really contribute to the superior predictive power, right? What is really kind of the mechanism, the nature of the superiority in the prediction, which I think is, very uncontroversial and good and important. And that's kind of where I think the paper has potentially, much more room to grow. And then there's the second part, which kind of tries to make the point that, based on this strategy, you can make money on, basically on the stock market by trading, which I think is much harder to sell, right? For institutional and technical reasons. I mean, number one, right, there's hedge funds out there. I mean, I even have friends who work at Citadel who day in, day out basically only do machine learning based on earning signal to earn a couple of cents with large volumes. And then also in terms of, if you look at the results, if you do a little bit of, back of the envelope calculations, you have a very short time series. You basically need very high Sharpe ratios, right, to come up with a t-stat of 2 and 3. And it's just very hard to believe that, that this is really kind of abnormal and not, already absorbed by some risk factor. So I think it's very likely that there might not be kind of abnormal performance based on this. And I think there's some, risk factors that you should include. We can talk about this later and do some model selection. But my point is basically, I'm not even sure that you need the second part where you show kind of outperformance, because if you do a proper kind of job controlling for all the risk factors, kind of, even risk factors on top of the five-factor model and thinking about higher moment risk, then just showing what absorbs kind of the abnormal return will tell you a lot about the firm characteristics that are kind of driving this, right? So, and, even if there's no outperformance in terms of the stock market strategy, then, this technology per se could still be very useful to many stakeholders, right? Kind of firm managers, so on and so forth. So I think I kind of agree with Eric's point that in terms of the methodology, I think that's at least kind of the area where I see a lot of room to grow. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate the comments. Yes, I agree with you. Because of the limited length of the time that we have so far since the adoption of the XBRL reports, we only have like 4 years to do the test, right? I agree with you. I mean, if you want to show some abnormal performance, you need to have like 10 years of data to show the robustness of your strategy. So that's why we put it in the back of the paper as opposed to the top of the paper, right? And in the writing, we try to not oversell, right, the abnormal profit results. But I completely agree with you. So maybe we can put more cautionary language regarding this trading strategy part. Yeah. Thank you.
Let's do one more, but a quick one, and then we should move on, as otherwise we're not going to get through. Matthias.
Okay, this is going to be super quick because it's very related to what Thomas was saying, and I'm just wondering how you weigh, by the way, whether you can briefly also elaborate on what's your view on in how important this type of machine learning and more data, etc., is for getting to abnormal returns, because I always found like this greater flexibility and better prediction is really something that is helpful in lots of contexts, but less so in the financial markets, because by its pure equilibrium design, you'll always have lots of information impounded already, and you have lots of incentives for people doing that. So we as academics don't tend to be the first to use these things. So then the question is that the best application for those models, or shouldn't we look somewhere else?
Thank you, Matthias. Yeah, as I mentioned previously, the abnormal return results is kind of we don't view this as strong as the first part regarding predicting the earnings. We can think of other applications, in addition to this, equity market applications. The point's well taken. Thank you. Okay, so perhaps I should continue.
Yes, please keep going, and then I'll get Stephen and Kevin later.
Okay, so regarding machine learning, just broadly speaking, we're going to handle numerous detailed financial items. So machine learning is well suited with this task because it can reduce the dimensionality. I'm going to introduce the machine learning algorithm we're using later. So this machine learning algorithm, so this fundamental analysis offer very little guidance on the variable selection and also on a functional form. The machine learning actually have a lot of flexibility and it casts a wild net in the specific search specifically, and can accommodate nonlinearity and interactions. Finally, fundamental analysis is essentially a task or problem of prediction, and machine learning will offer high out-of-sample performance by using some regularization to mitigate the overfit. So I'm going to turn to that in details. All right, so since we don't see this machine learning algorithm very often in our research, let me just introduce the background here. So we're using two machine learning algorithms based on decision trees. So decision trees basically do things non-parametrically, and then we'll basically group the observations by splitting on one predictor and in each step. So here I give you an example of a decision tree that has already been developed into 3 groups, and the forecast basically will be the group average. However, let's say given this tree has already been developed by the machine, given, let's say, a sample, how the machine going to develop the tree? It will do things as follows. First, it started with all the sample, the full sample, and then it will try every possible cutoff for each predictor. Suppose you only have 2 predictors. Each predictor has 4 cutoffs. It will try all 8 possibilities, and then choose the one that yield the minimum forecasted errors. Right? So once it's settled on one variable, it will continue with the partition of variable and so on. So it will basically, the split will stop when the forecast error cannot be further reduced or some pre-specified criteria are met, such as the tree depths, some parameters you can set. So this is another representation of the tree I previously showed you. It shows how the space of EPS and the leverage are partitioned into 3 groups. And this tree can be recast as a linear function here. So the predictor basically will be this linear combination, and the beta 1, 2, 3 will be the mean outcome variable in each group. And now the advantage of this tree, decision trees, becomes apparent. First, although it considers all the predictors, all the possible cutoffs, it will only use one predictor at a time. So we don't need sufficient number of observations relative to the number of predictors. And second is invariant to monotonic transformation. It can approximate high degree of nonlinearity because we're using this cutoff. It can also allow this, multiple ways of interactions. For example, here we have leverage and EPS interactions. Although the tree has some flexibility, it also tends to overfit the data. Right? So it may do well in sample, but out of sample, it won't perform well. So we need some regularization. In our paper, we consider 2 regularizers. First one is a random forest. It has 2 key elements. One is bagging, the other is dropout. So bagging stands for bootstrapping plus aggregation. Basically, it will work on a bunch of bootstrap sample, so not the full sample. And then for each bootstrap sample, it will develop decision trees. And each tree will yield a prediction for an observation, let's say Y1 head to YM head. And the aggregation basically going to take the mean of each prediction, and that's going to be the ensemble prediction. So the decision tree may overfit each bootstrap sample. By taking the average, it helps to reduce the variance and improve the out-of-sample performance. Second, there may be some dominant variables such as firm size. So the tree always split on such variable in the lower level of the tree. It will yield the prediction that are highly correlated, right? It's not desirable. So the dropout procedure will use only a random key variables for each split. So this dominant variable may not be considered for some trees, right? This decorrelation will help, again, further reduce the variance of the prediction and improve the performance. So I like the random forest. The second regularizer we're using, stochastic gradient boosting. It developed trees not independently, but sequentially, right? So each tree will be developed based on forecasting error from the previous tree. We call that boosting. And for each step, we're going to use random samples. Again, not the full sample. So this is the stochastic component. It's helped to decorrelate the estimators, in each step. So the way it works, basically, it started with some random some initial guess. For example, let's say take a average of the outcome variable f0x, and then we'll have some residuals r0, and then the tree will be developed to predict the residue, right? Not the y. Once the tree were developed, we have this y0 head. It will be shrunken by a parameter rho and then added to the initial guess. We're going to have the second forecaster, which is f1x. So this rho stands for this learning rate is basically ranges from 0 to 1. Again, it was used to mitigate overfit to the original data. So we're gonna keep doing that for m steps. So the final predictor fmx will be the ensemble prediction. Okay, I guess let me just
let's do another round right here. Stephen, please.
So I think I kind of had some similar thoughts as Eric. You know, it seems like a very interesting exercise, but at the end, I'm not quite sure what you want us to take away from it exactly. And I think for me, part of that confusion was from how you describe your contribution. You say you contribute to the fundamental analysis literature by applying machine learning. That's not really a contribution, that's a description of what you did. So maybe kind of clearly saying what you want the fundamental analysis literature to take away from what you did would be helpful. So what do you kind of view as your key kind of contribution here to that literature specifically?
Sure. So let me just jump a little ahead regarding the contribution. I do have slides, by the way, but let me just talk briefly about that. So I think the prior literature, you know, one of the big questions was how people are satisfied with the financial reports, right? People want to examine the value relevance, you know, the predictive ability of financial reports information. And typically the way people doing that was taking, you know, some summary items such as earnings, right, book value, maybe a couple of other line items, and to predict, let's say, future earnings, future cash flow, and to correlate those variables with stock price and returns. And the results they got is super, dissatisfaction there because they found a low R-squared, right, and also find a, continued declining in the relevance of those accounting numbers, right. So one way to view that is because you're not using all the information on financial reports. There are a lot of useful information in footnotes disclosure, right, for example, right? And the reason you got dissatisfied R-squared or predictive power or explanatory power is because you're not using the entire detailed financial information, right? So, and how are we going to use that? We're going to use some machine learning methodology to extract useful information from the entire detailed financial report.
So would you say the takeaway is that people aren't using all of the financial information and your results suggest that they should be?
Yeah, it's there valuable information there, and it's just how you're going to extract those information.
Okay, that's helpful for me. Thank you.
Evan.
Awesome. Sort of related to Stephen's comment, while one of the big purposes of this is to be able to identify where the information is located in the financial statements themselves, it's difficult to do so when you start throwing in many potentially collinear variables with one another. So one of the, you guys use Bryman 2001 methodology to measure feature importance throughout the paper. It essentially measures, like, when you delete a variable, how much does the prediction accuracy decrease? But when you throw in so many variables, like in the setting of XBRL, you can no longer interpret the incremental value of any one of those variables. If you can imagine, like, throwing assets, liabilities, and equity into a model, dropping any one of them won't affect the prediction accuracy. And so my question was sort of, are we really able to learn anything about the feature importances themselves of what's important if you're analyzing so many variables at once? And could that sort of explain why it's inconsistent across your table 6?
Okay, when you say inconsistent, what are you referring to?
That part, maybe we should wait till we get to table 6, but sure. It's sort of unstable in your feature importances.
Okay, so we do actually examine the feature importance. I guess you're jump ahead about the importance. Yeah, so we basically examine the variable importance by reshuffle this variable and then look at how would that affect the predictive power. This is an intuitive way to do that. There may be more advanced way to do that. So we choose the intuitive way because it's really new methodology, relatively new methodology in the field. Only a couple of few papers using this method. So yeah. we can talk more about that. We have a machine learning co-author, so whatever fancy way you want to do that, we can just go for that.
Okay, it's just as it stands right now, you're not going to be able to, I guess what I want to say is they're uninterpretable as they stand, right? You can't, it'll shoot you out a number, but you won't be able to.
Okay, maybe we can talk more about that when we talk, get to that table.
Before I call on Jeremy, just to sort of draw something together with the chat, I think what Kevin is saying is slightly different. It's not about sort of fancy machine learning, but to think a bit more conceptually about what it means when we have that many similar variables in there. And Oliver made a similar comment in the chat where he said, to what extent are we using any expert knowledge about financial statement analysis or fundamental analysis? So maybe thinking a bit more about which are variables that we would, classes of variables that we think would have certain meaning or relevance here, and then sort of not have all of them in at the same time would allow you to better interpret what Kevin is getting at.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to rebound on these questions. So there are ways to regroup variables to kind of understand which groups are more important than others. And I think that speaks about some of the collinearity and clarifies where the explanation really is. There's also another way I think about the contribution, and that's not as easy as it seems by reading the paper, but choosing the right model is a lot of computational work. And in particular, in the paper, there is the choice of the tuned hyperparameters. And this is kind of essential because if we don't tune them right, by choosing these hyperparameters the way we want, we might see actually what the testing sample is. So we need a method that takes that away from the hands of researchers. So you tune this, and I think reporting what is these tuned parameters can then be picked up by researchers, because if you don't have those, you have to run the model maybe 100 or 200 times. And so I take away from this also a more technical contribution, which if you want to do this, this is the model you should be using. Now on table 4, that's kind of where you go, but your grid is pretty small. And in fact, what the headache for me, that's been always the case, is you always end on a corner of that grid. And so I think it's important to get the grid to a point where you're inside. You're not getting in the corner, because you're in the corner, it's as if you just chose a number. So just selling more, the tuning, I think, is another contribution of what you're doing.
Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate that comment. Yes, so we report the parameters we want to tune. We also report the finally chosen parameters. Actually, to me, I think most of them are not on the boundary, which basically means it's not like a corner solution, right? It's some interior solution. But whether it's like a global interior solution, we don't know. I agree with you. So so we just choose. We have some guidance from the machine learning literature. Many of them we think is just a natural choice to do, but I agree with you. It's computational intensive.
Miguel, one quick, and then we'll have to move on.
Hi, Yue. Going back to the issue of contribution and also connecting with what people want to know and Jeremy's suggestions, I think I've read a bunch of these papers, and as someone saying in the chat, there are several working papers that are going on now. These to me seems one of the better ones, if not the best. So part of the contribution is explaining all of the things you do to reach what is a reasonably good prediction model, right? The tuning, also the use of XBRL to aggregate and use all of the features. I think that needs to be discussed more at the beginning of the paper. What is it that your paper does to come up with a good prediction? That will help, I guess.
Thank you, Miguel. Yes, I think so. The introduction actually is already fairly long, but we can introduce more things here regarding our model selection.
Sure, asking for more is always free, but
Thank you.
It's just it's not just the machine learning prediction, but why is this prediction important, and why is your type of prediction particularly important?
You mean regarding other machine learning algorithms?
Yeah, in the fundamental signal. I mean, this is a literature that is ongoing and has been ongoing for a number of years, right? So why is your paper important to this stream?
To the fundamental analysis stream? Sorry, I don't get the...
Yeah, well, anyway, we can talk later.
Okay, so basically there are a bunch of machine learning algorithms. If we view the complexity of the machine learning algorithm, on the left hand, let's say extreme, there are some simple machine learning algorithms such as ridge regression, lasso regression. So, but those models do not accommodate this nonlinearity and the interactions. On the other hand, the most extreme, complex model is a neural network. So the model we were choosing, this random forest and stochastic gradient boosting, is sort of right in the middle, and it was used a lot in the industry. So we think, it's achieved a lot of real world good applications. So we think it's a good choice for us. But I agree with you. We can try. There are a bunch of there out there, so we can try as many as we would like. But we have to do some trade-off and stop at some point. Okay, so let me just continue regarding the second challenge, the scalability. So we overcome the second challenge by using this financial reports in XBRL format. XBRL stands for Extensible Business Reporting Language. It's nothing more than a standard list of tags to describe financial information. It's provide a means to convert financial reports from human readable to a machine readable format. So the keyword here is standard. So as long as everything is standardized, we can easily digitalize the financial reports for large scale analysis. So we refer to this standard list of tags as taxonomy. There are many taxonomies here. US, I think we use US GAAP taxonomy. So XBRL US, a nonprofit organization, a spin-off from AICPA, created this first taxonomy, and then FASB took it over and maintained this. So basically, update this on an annual basis. So this taxonomy is like a dictionary. It provides the tags, standard list of tags for financial items, and also associated contextual information, things like the definition, authoritative references, and also the calculation relationship with all the other items. So when the company cannot find appropriate standard tags, it was allowed to create their own tags. So we call that custom tags or extensions. So right now, okay, let me just give you an example, quick example about XBRL. This is about company Little Fuse. Here on the top, this is just HTML file we use very often, this human readable. And then below is the machine readable XBRL documents. If I click on the 10K human readable documents, suppose I'm looking for cash and cash equivalents, you can find this number in a nicely tabulated balance sheet. However, this number is not machine readable. So you have to click on this, the XBRL document, you will get something like this. You see the number, row number were enclosed by a beginning tag and the closing tag. In the beginning tag, it shows it's US GAAP, not IFRS. The tag name, right, cash and cash equivalent at carrying value, no space in between. So it's standardized by the taxonomy. US dollar unit, which date you're referring to, and decimal point -3 means rounded up to 1,000 for the presentation. Right? So by doing this, the machine can understand what this raw number means. Okay, right now, all the public US companies have to prepare the financial reports in XBRL format. Thanks to this SEC mandate, this report is in addition to, as opposed to replacing the traditional format. So in the XBRL report, firms are required to tag the quantitative amount in financial statements in the first year of adoption, and the footnotes, quantitative numbers in footnotes since second year of adoption. The options are implemented in a 3-year phasing basis. So basically, if we're interested in all the public companies' quantitative amount on their financial statement and footnotes, we're talking about mid-June 2012. Right? So that's basically after that we have all the data. To ease the adoption, SEC says the XBRL filings need not be audited. Also, errors in these documents are protected by this limited liability within 24 months since the first initial adoption. Okay, so there's a bunch of advantages of using this XBRL tag data. First, it's free of charge. You can download it from Edgar or company website. SEC also parse all the XBRL documents and put them in a nice relational database on the SEC website. You can just download all of them for your analysis. At this point in time, SEC require company to fully align the XBRL documents with their original 10K filings or 10Q filings. So there's going to be no backfilling. So if a company restates a number on 10K, let's say issue a 10K amendment, then there will be a separate XBRL document for the 10K amendment. So you can trace the full history of that number over time. It also provides a lot of detailed information, like things like footnotes information, things like breakdowns on line items on the financial statements. Of course, we recognize there's some, cons of this XBRL tag data. There are some data quality issues, in particular in the early years of adoption. Steve Princey et al. Look at the first 400 XBRL filings. They find that 1/4 of them actually have errors. In a separate study, they take a look at the customer tags of 67 large filers in the first round of submission. They find that about 41% of the extensions are unnecessary because some equivalent standard tags are available in the US taxonomy. This is going to create some data inconsistency issues. But there are some compensating factors related to the continuing investment into the improvement of the quality of XBRL documents. So this SEC will periodically issue some staff observations and even some comment letter to company regarding their XBRL documents errors. This XBRL US will set rules, will provide some guidance on the best practices of XBRL filings. They also have data quality committee, which publish this real time, the errors in companies' XBRL documents in real time. So I provide the link on my paper. So if you're interested, you can just take a look at that. Fascinating things there going on. So we have also the third-party monitoring. This XBRL cloud is, filing service companies. They also, keep monitoring in the real time of XBRL documents errors. Okay, so before going to the contribution.
John has been patiently waiting, and just so that you're aware, you have 20 minutes left, right?
Sure.
Approximately. Okay, John, go ahead.
Yeah, back as you were going to the contributions, I think, but in terms of the framing, right? I don't know if you're aware of kind of the Sendel piece about, prediction policy problems. And when I think of kind of, you're saying your contributions to fundamental analysis, I think of more of like a causal, right? The relationship between revenue and earnings it's not necessarily a prediction problem, right? So think about like, do I need to take an umbrella if it rains today, or should I do a rain dance to make it rain, right? One requires just prediction, which is kind of what the machine learning is doing, is like, is the threshold high enough that I take an umbrella? Whether I dance a rain dance requires a causal mechanism between, does actually dancing lead to rain, right? So I feel like maybe framing the analysis within these two kind of paradigms, and this is helpful in the set of research that wants to have kind of controls for like expectations, but it's not really that helpful if we were trying to get at causally some of the measures in accounting that we have, right? Some of our disclosure rules and stuff like that, where it requires a causal chain between the measurement rule and price, right? So I think something like that could kind of help delineate, where the paper fits in, rather than, because right now it just seems that it's a prediction exercise, which is fine, but that isn't kind of clearly stated as why do we need another prediction exercise? If you understand kind of how.
Oh, okay. Thank you, John. I appreciate the comments. I agree. We are not seeing any causal inferences, although some paper are using machine learning for some causal inferences by finding a properly controlled sample using machine learning. But here we're not doing that. So we simply just interested in the predicting work. And I think the contribution is because we're introducing this machine learning, and also we're using large set of detailed financial data, which hasn't been examined in its entirety by the prior research.
Yeah, but that's for like a certain subset of the literature, right? Like that's for kind of these prediction problems in terms of estimating portfolios and stuff like that, where yes. I care about matching, but it doesn't help me kind of understand the causal mechanism, right? Mm-hmm. Between certain attributes, right? Back to kind of one of the previous comments, as you throw in all these interactions in there, it's hard to interpret what it actually means, right?
Right. I think one of the, if you talk with machine learning people, one of my co-authors, they actually, in that literature, they don't put too much emphasis on the causal inferences, right? They mainly care about out of sample performance. Different approach had their own advantage and disadvantage. I agree with you. Machine learning definitely cannot say anything about the causality. So maybe we can put some cautionary language there to emphasize that. Okay, so let me continue. Okay, regarding the contribution, so we contribute to the fundamental analysis literature because the existing research examining just handful of summary items, things like earnings, book value, or capex, R&D, a bunch of line items on the financial statement, and they report a growing dissatisfaction with the relevance of those numbers to investor decisions. So Burke has, recently had a book with his co-authors examining using 6 decades of data, showing this decline of, earnings, book values, summary measures in explaining or predicting corporate performance. So we think it's important to examine the entire detailed financial data so that we don't miss the important information that are produced by accountants, written in the financial reports, but not included in analysis. So there are a bunch of recent papers also use machine learning, but they're examining just small set of variables, so they cannot speak to this entire detailed financial data. So second, we contribute to the XBRL adoption literature. That literature use mostly difference in difference approach and document capital market consequences or consequences regarding corporate reporting. However, so they assume that those XBRL documents are useful for investors. That assumption was sort of challenged by some other research documenting errors and unnecessary extensions in those documents. So we provide this direct evidence showing that those XBRL tax financial data, despite data quality issues, are still useful for investors for their prediction and forecast. And lastly, I think we contribute broadly to the machine learning application in accounting. So it's this conference, we already see so many exciting papers, right? So we contribute to that literature by applying this to fundamental analysis. Okay, so let me talk more about our methodology. The outcome variable we're using is the direction of 1 year ahead earnings changes. As proposed by O and Penman, using this outcome variable has several advantages. First, it captures the fundamentals at the conceptual level. It captures fundamentals as opposed to using future returns, which reflect both fundamentals and compensation for risk. Second, it's yield conservative results because it disregards the earnings information beyond 1 year. So we are less likely to find abnormal returns if we just look at this 1 year ahead information. And then lastly, it's very important. It's basically prior literature try to use firm characteristics to forecast the earnings. It's just model E/T plus 1 as a function of X. Right? But they find that this model is not substantially better than just simple random walk model, which is just using current year earnings to predict next year earnings. Right? So what it says basically, if you want to predict the change in earnings, if we move this ET to the left-hand side, it's hard to predict. The best you can get is like a random arrow here. So we think it's worthwhile to try some simpler model, just forecasting the direction as opposed to the amount of the future changing earnings. So we also examine the predicting the amount of earnings, and we don't find a good out of sample performance, which is consistent with the prior findings. And we're also informed by the literature that the performer earnings used by analysts actually having higher quality and more value relevant than the GAAP earnings and also the non-GAAP earnings provided by the managers. So we're going to use this performer earnings to measure this direction of 1 year ahead earnings change. All right, so here's how we,
let's maybe get Oliver's been patiently waiting right in front of his very modest home. So let's get his question.
Sure.
Thanks. Thanks for the paper, UI. Just one question about your prior slide. So you motivate your paper with the fact that simple models like the random walk outperform models, more complicated models like the Wu and Penman model. But then at the same time, you use Wu and Penman as your benchmark. So given that finding, you motivate your paper with, wouldn't it be more appropriate to also check more simple benchmarks in this case? For example, the random walk. In this case, if there was an earnings increase, I predict that earnings also increase in the next year. Or if you believe Farmer and French and Nissim and Penman, that earnings might decrease because of mean reversion. So super simple models rather than these more complex models that have been shown to be outperformed by the simple models.
Thank you, Oliver. I appreciate this comment. I'm glad you bring this up. So if we think about this random walk model, right? If we move this ET to the left-hand side of this equation, basically it says the earnings change, follow a random variable, and it's basically a random guess, right? If we're taking this random walk model seriously, the benchmark would be, the earnings increase versus earnings decrease will be 50-50, right? It's like a random guess benchmark. So we do comparing the performance of our model with a random guess, which is 50% area under the curve. So I'm going to show you in a few slides.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about random guess. I'm talking about either persistence or mean reversion.
Okay, we can think of other models like a estimated time series model. Yes.
It increased last year, increases this year. It increases last year, it decreases this year.
Okay, so if you're talking about the drift, we follow the Owen Penman's practice where we de-drift the earnings stream over the past 4 years. So
no, that's not what I'm talking about. Okay. I'm just talking about very simple random walk predictions here.
Okay, yeah, no. So this is a random walk for earnings levels. So if you're talking about random walk regarding the earnings change, we can do that. Yeah. All right, so this is our rolling window. We basically train the model using we estimate the model using the training period, and then we basically choose all the parameters from here in this table, and then in the validation sample, we choose the parameter that give us the best out of sample performance. So once we're settled on the model on the parameters, we're gonna apply the model in the testing period. So we have only 4 testing periods from 2015 to 2018. All right, so this is our sample selection. We start with XBR filings with the performer earnings data, and then we end up with about 8,000 firm year observations. Here's the distribution over time. Unsurprisingly, we have a very little observations in the first year because this footnote disclosure tagging only started after the mid-June 2012. Okay, so here is how we generate our predictors. There are 3 types of tags from XBRL documents. The first one is customer tags. It accounts for about 15.5%. Second one is uncommon standard tags. Those are the standard tags, but are depreciated or newly added to the taxonomy throughout our sample period. It accounts for about 4.5%. Because those tags are not populated consistently throughout our sample period, we're going to throw out these 2 type of tags. We're going to only use this common standard tags, so the tags that are used at least once in each year of our sample period. And we have about 4,600 tag predictors. We're going to take the current value, lagged value, and the percentage change. So we end up with about 14,000 predictors. Okay, let me maybe take questions.
Yeah, we'll take 2 questions, and Yue, just for your timekeeping, you have 10 more minutes. Sure. Eric, and then Bob.
Hey, Yue. It seems like the way the paper is currently set up, you're essentially conducting machine learning to sort of develop these forecasts of innovations and earnings, and then using those forecasts to predict returns. And it feels like a lot of the narrative then becomes that investors are missing out on some portion of the machine learning model, including some of these nonlinear relations. it seems like an alternative way that you may want to think about setting up this paper is to run the same type of model, both in predicting future changes in earnings, but also apply this machine learning technique to returns. And then there you have some features that you're reporting some of the summary statistics about how many of these variables are relevant to sort of like the relevance of trees. And so it seems like you could actually get a little bit more information about the parallels between like what forecasts earnings versus returns. And so I don't know, have you guys given any thought to setting it up that way? If not, it seems potentially useful for some of these comments relating to like, what are we learning perhaps about the investor decision process?
Yes, very good suggestion, Eric. Yes, so we have thought a lot about that. I know Bob Hausen has a paper, regarding the Owen Penman's version. Basically, you're not just predicting the direction of earnings, you also want to predict the direction of future returns. We have done that. We haven't included that in the paper. We thought the paper is already fairly long, but I agree with you. There are a lot of richness we could explore. So we could use our methodology to predict the future returns, and then see whether the variable that are important change across this two kind of methodology of predicting earnings versus predicting future returns. Thank you.
Anyway,
yes.
I was a little surprised, and this follows up on Oliver's comment from before, that the Owen Penman is such a, that you use it so much as your benchmark for this. It would seem like, first of all, the paper you just referenced that Dave and I wrote, we basically showed that the Ewan Penman result didn't work in the subsequent period. And we did show that you could predict returns, and that seemed to be more stable than predicting earnings. And we also showed that the way that Ewan Penman actually did it, which it appears that you replicated, where they just look at what coefficients are significant at the 10% level, and then they throw everything else away, that they were throwing away a lot of information through that procedure. So it really seemed like, that's a 1992 paper, God knows that. I'm not saying that my paper is the benchmark by any means, but it just seems like the focus on Ewan Penman is very strange as a benchmark in terms of trying to say that this is actually moving fundamental analysis forward. So you might just want to think about if there are other benchmarks like Oliver talked about, or more recent papers that would give you a better benchmark for trying to say that this is a good way to go. That's all.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate the comments. Yes, we have thought a lot about, actually we try to avoid using the word benchmark in the paper because, as you said, there are many other, fundamental analysis models out there. So why you choose Owen and Penman as a benchmark? So we think we use that as an example to understand the usefulness of our model. But I agree with you, we could try many other, more recently developed models to evaluate our model's performance. So one more thing I want to emphasize. So we actually also use an alternative example to evaluate the performance of our model, which is the analyst forecast. So we're comparing our model, the performance of our model with that of analyst forecast to see, actually our model, outperform analyst forecast. This is just another example. Thank you.
No, I agree with that. I saw that, but that almost comes as an afterthought in the paper. So the most of the focus appears to be on Ewan Penman, and at the very end you throw an analyst forecast, and you don't even think about other alternatives. And it just seems like that would be an important thing to do to try to push the literature forward. That's all.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. We will think about other models to as a benchmark to compare. Yeah. Okay. So let me just continue. So here's our main results out of sample performance. So we have two models, random forest and stochastic gradient boost. So the AUC basically represent the chance that a randomly chosen earnings increase will be ranked higher by our model than a randomly chosen earnings decrease. Right? A random guess will be basically 50%. So our model certainly generates an AUC which is higher than 50%. We also, test the statistic difference by using this bootstrap p-value, or which is lower than 1%. So this is not unlikely to be a random outcome. So to understand the the source of our model's predictive power, we just follow the literature, calculating the importance by calculating the decrease in AUC if a predictor is randomly shuffled. Here's the top 10 important predictors. We see a lot of them are, yeah, I think a lot of them are related to earnings, right? So it suggests that there's still important metrics in fundamental analysis relative to other items. So we also group the individual variable importance by the category, financial statement category. We see that in aggregate, footnotes contribute a lot to the predictive power of our model. You may notice that footnotes contains a lot of items, right? We also calculate the average importance. So it's lower than other financial statement, but it's still considerable here for the footnotes disclosure items. Okay, to understand which items in footnotes are important, we also prepare or calculate the importance by each category. So within footnotes, we find that a lot of tax items are important. So it's consistent with the tax literature, shows that those tax-related items carry important information regarding the future taxable income. As for example, the first one, top one, deferred tax asset valuation allowance. I think so Miller and Skinner 1998 paper used a hand-collected sample 200 firm and shows that this variable is negatively associated with future taxable income. Indeed, we sort of confirm this relation in our machine learning model. We find a negative relation between this deferred tax asset valuation allowance and predicted future earnings increase. It's nonlinear. We also show some interaction here by plotting this heat map, where the x-axis stands for operating income and the y-axis stands for the allowance. And when the color becomes lighter, the probability of an earnings increase is higher. So you see when this valuation allowance becomes lower, and when this operating income becomes higher, then we get the highest probability of an earnings increase. All right, so we also compare our model with O&M payments. This is the AUC curve. The first thing we notice that when we replicate O&M payments, so OP stands for O&M payment 65 financial variables. We just follow them using the logistic regressions. We got an AUC about 62%. So here we just reproduce our results using XBRL data and machine learning. We get a much higher AUC. We also want to understand the difference, the superior performance of our model compared with O&M payment. So we apply this machine learning model to O&M payment financial ratios. We got something in between. So the interpretation basically was, if we apply machine learning to O&M payment model, O&M payment financial ratios, we got a better performance is because of nonlinear predictor interactions, which are missed by regression or just regressions. And we got a marginal outperformance of using XBRL data and the machine learning. It's because there's, it's more detailed data, but it's kind of offsetted by the data quality issues. So we have some tests regarding data quality issue by applying this CompuStat items, which has some advantages and disadvantages compared to SPR documents. We also, so I'm going to skip this one. We also take a look at the temporal change in the data quality. Early period, lower quality, later period, higher quality. We compute the data quality by using this proportion of custom and uncommon standard tags to measure the data quality we use in our model. We find that for high data quality sample, we have a higher out of sample performance, which is consistent with data quality issue, reduce the usefulness of XBR documents. Okay, so just I think we have
we're
1 minute.
Time is up. We have to wrap up, please.
Okay, yeah. So trading strategies. Let me just go to this one graph, and then I'm gonna wrap up. So this is basically the key results. We find our strategy outperformed O&M payments strategy and outperform this, the strategy we apply machine learning to O&M payments financial ratios, and then we do some, we compare our model with analyst forecast. So let me just conclude. We apply machine learning to detailed financial data. We think it's going to unleash significant predictive power, which is higher than this O&M payments original model. which we think this superior performance stems from primarily the nonlinear predictor interaction, and then secondarily from more detailed financial data. It appears that stock market has not fully incorporated those fundamental signals. Okay, thank you for your comments. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you, guys. And thanks, everybody, for joining us, authors, participants, especially for your active participation in live as well as in the chat to sort of make this remote environment as much fun as we can. So I think this was an excellent event, really enjoyed it. And as a maybe final shout out, the pandemic has been hard on all of us, but research shows that it's been especially hard on women and mothers. And so I want to say happy Mother's Day to all the mothers, and enjoy the day tomorrow. You've deserve it. And goodbye, everybody.